¿Están haciendo algún tipo de estudios
Buenos
adicionales?
días a todos. Morning. Welcome. Bienvenidos al segundo día de nuestro evento, el EU-CELAC Academic Forum. El día de hoy vamos a tener 3 paneles. El primer panel que trata sobre derecho laboral y las implicaciones de esta cumbre EU-CELAC y cómo la cumbre EU-CELAC tiene una repercusión en este derecho laboral en Colombia. Segundo panel, lo mismo para el medio ambiente. Tercer panel, lo mismo para derechos humanos. El día de hoy quiero mantenerme muy corto y simplemente darles la bienvenida a ustedes, pero también agradecer a EULA, agradecer a KU Leuven, el Centro de Estudios de Gobernanza Global EGS de KU Leuven, agradecer a la Facultad de la Escuela de Gobierno de la Universidad de los Andes, también a mi facultad, la Facultad de Derecho y el Semillero de Comercio, Derecho y Globalización. Los dejo con un panel muy interesante, un panel que sin duda nos va a traer unas reflexiones muy importantes en estas épocas de tormentas en comercio global y de necesidad de regulación laboral. Entonces los dejo con la moderadora Ana Wandu. Muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia y por acompañarnos el día de hoy.
Gracias, Simón, y bienvenidos a todos a este primer panel del segundo día que se intitula Lograr la protección laboral a través de los acuerdos de libre comercio, las perspectivas de la Unión Europea y América Latina. El panel va a ser principalmente en español, pero tenemos una persona que se está conectando desde Bélgica que va a intervenir en inglés. Hoy vamos a tratar 3 puntos principalmente y son las experiencias de negociación de los tratados de libre comercio, de las cláusulas de protección a los trabajadores en los tratados de libre comercio, cómo se aplican estas cláusulas y el papel de la sociedad civil en las negociaciones y en los mecanismos de aplicación de estas cláusulas en los tratados de libre comercio. Yo invito a los panelistas y a ustedes que tengan la siguiente pregunta en mente a lo largo de la discusión y es: ¿los tratados de libre comercio son el buen escenario para garantizar la protección de los derechos de los trabajadores o no? ¿Cuáles son las ventajas y desventajas? Entonces les invito a que guarden esa pregunta en mente a través de la discusión. Antes de empezar, quiero presentarles a los distinguidos panelistas, son expertos en la materia. Empezaré con el doctor Italo Cardona, que es el director de la oficina de la OIT para los países andinos. Es licenciado en Filosofía y Ciencias Jurídicas por la Universidad Centroamericana de El Salvador. Cuenta con una maestría en Dirección y Gerencia de la Universidad de Salamanca y una especialización en Evaluación de Políticas Públicas por el Instituto Internacional de Administración Pública de París. Tiene más de 20 años de trayectoria profesional en la OIT. Ya trabajó en Colombia en 2016 y también es profesor titular de Derecho Laboral y Filosofía en la Universidad Centroamericana de El Salvador y ha sido profesor invitado en universidades en Colombia y en Perú, donde reside actualmente. Teníamos la presencia del doctor Fabio Arias Giraldo, presidente de la Central Unitaria de Trabajadores de Colombia, quien desafortunadamente no podrá unirse esta mañana porque lo llamaron de urgencias para ir a la cumbre CELAC en Santa Marta. Entonces les presenta sus disculpas por no poder estar acá presente. Nos escucha a distancia Cristina Giesel, la profesora, es una profesora de Derecho Laboral en la Universidad de KU Leuven y profesora invitada de Seguridad Social en la Universidad de Yonsei en Seúl, Corea. Obtuvo su máster en Derecho y licenciatura de Filología y Filosofía en la Universidad de Innsbruck, un máster en Derecho Laboral y Social Europeo en la Universidad de Tilburg y un doctorado en la Universidad de Economía y Negocios de Viena. Como investigadora trabajó principalmente en Corea y lo que nos va a aportar hoy es esa perspectiva del caso coreano y ver qué lecciones podemos aplicar sobre ese caso a América Latina. A mi derecha se encuentra el profesor Daniel López, quien es abogado y filósofo de la Universidad Javeriana. Cuenta con una especialización en Derecho Administrativo de la Universidad Externado de Colombia, una maestría en Derecho Laboral y es actualmente candidato a doctor en Derecho de la Universidad Javeriana también. Es profesor de esta universidad, es investigador del Observatorio Laboral de la Javeriana también y es socio de la firma de abogados MGL y Asociados. Bueno, y yo me presento, Ana María Obando, soy estudiante de doctorado en la Universidad de KU Leuven, abogada de esta universidad, de la Universidad de los Andes, y Y precisamente cuando estaba acá estudiando Derecho, lo que más me gustaba era el Derecho laboral. Cuando me fui a estudiar al extranjero, intenté estudiar Derecho Internacional Económico y este tema justo es una mezcla de esas dos ramas del derecho, en la cual el Derecho laboral y el Derecho Internacional Económico se encuentran. Lo veíamos ayer en el panel de digital, donde se discutía si la transición digital podía ser completamente desconectada de las cuestiones de derechos humanos y de consultar a las poblaciones. Lo mismo pasa con este tema de los tratados de libre comercio y la protección a los trabajadores. Si bien la globalización ha facilitado una integración económica, también ha intensificado cuestionamientos respecto a las garantías que tienen los trabajadores por explotación laboral, el dumping social, la tendencia a bajar los derechos laborales para ser más competitivos y la desigualdad en el poder de negociación de los tratados de libre comercio entre los países. Aunque se ha intentado incorporar estas cláusulas de protección en las organizaciones mundiales del comercio, estos intentos no fueron satisfactorios y los países decidieron dejar esto a cargo de la OIT y que no estuviera en manos de la OMC en las negociaciones. Lo que hizo que los países intentaran incluir estas cláusulas de protección a trabajadores en los tratados de libre comercio y no en las negociaciones multilaterales. Y en estos tratados de libre comercio se hace referencia a los estándares de la OIT. Entonces, para empezar, me gustaría preguntarle al doctor Cardona, ¿cuáles son esos principios y derechos fundamentales en el trabajo protegidos por la Organización Internacional de Trabajo al que hacen referencia a los tratados de libre comercio?
Ahora, ya, gracias. Bueno, buenos días a todos, todas. Gracias por la invitación a este conversatorio y gracias por la posibilidad de vernos y de conversar sobre un tema que es, por supuesto, muy importante para todos y todas, y por supuesto para esta región en particular. Efectivamente, cuando hablamos sobre los derechos fundamentales en el trabajo, es lo que básicamente la OIT reconoció en su declaración de 1998 como los derechos humanos básicos relacionados al mundo del trabajo. Y en ese momento estableció como 4 grandes pilares de los derechos fundamentales. Hace 3 años incluyó un 5.º pilar, lo que te significa que no es un tema estático, que no son los únicos derechos fundamentales y que pueden seguirse construyendo directamente. ¿Cuáles son esos? En el 98 lo que la OIT señaló es que estos 4 pilares, el primero, no es prioritario, son como todos derechos humanos, obviamente una visión interrelacionada. El primero es libertad sindical y negociación colectiva, el derecho que tienen empleadores y trabajadores de afiliarse para defender sus intereses y, por supuesto, negociar mejores condiciones de trabajo en función del ejercicio de diálogo social y con las condiciones que efectivamente la OIT siempre está proponiendo y construyendo en los países. Un segundo elemento está vinculado a la no discriminación, vinculada a cómo asegurar el cierre de estas brechas que existen en el mundo del trabajo y cómo se va avanzando. Un tercer elemento es la erradicación del trabajo infantil y la otra es la lucha contra el trabajo forzoso. Son estos 4 pilares que se determinaron en 1998, son 8 convenios de la OIT y que a partir de ellos se ha venido impulsando y han sido retomados, asumidos en muchos de los capítulos laborales de los tratados de libre comercio que los países de América Latina tienen no solo con Europa, pero por supuesto incluidos allí. Hace 3 años la OIT, la Organización, Empleadores, Trabajadores y Gobiernos, decidieron que se establecía un 5.º pilar de derechos fundamentales y es la seguridad y salud en el trabajo. Se entendía entonces que crear condiciones de trabajo seguras y saludables era un derecho que pertenecía a toda la humanidad y no solamente a un grupo de trabajadores que estuviese vinculado a una relación laboral pública o privada, sino que correspondería a todas las personas que están llevando. Entonces, cuando hablamos de derechos fundamentales, estamos hablando de estos 5 pilares, pero estamos hablando de mucho más. Y cuando la OIT ha hablado sobre esto y ha hablado sobre la necesidad de avanzar e incluir, no solo incluirlos, sino que promover su cumplimiento, también hay una preocupación muy grande sobre cómo se fortalece la gobernanza dentro del mundo del trabajo, dentro de cada uno de los países, no solo a nivel internacional, sino que cada uno de los países. Entonces yo creo que sí es interesante cuando uno ve este tema, y sé que vamos a seguir conversando en unos minutos, cuando uno ve el tema de derechos fundamentales de la Declaración del 98, no disasociarla de la Declaración del 2008 sobre la justicia social, en un mundo globalizado, porque es donde se habla sobre los mecanismos de gobernanza que son los responsables efectivamente de promover que estos derechos fundamentales también en cada uno de los países se vuelva una garantía eficaz.
Gracias. Para que tengan una idea, acá se están mostrando los tratados de libre comercio que tiene la Unión Europea con países de América Latina. Como pueden ver, cubre casi todos los países del continente. Notablemente el de Europa con Colombia, Perú, al que después se unió Ecuador. El acuerdo con Centroamérica, que incluye Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panamá y El Salvador. El acuerdo con Chile y México, que están siendo modernizados. Y probablemente el de Mercosur sí es ratificado por ambas partes. En todos estos tratados que acabo de mencionar, siempre está incluido en el capítulo de Comercio y Desarrollo Sostenible esta referencia a los principios que acaba de explicar el doctor Cardona. Y quisiera hacerle la siguiente pregunta, y es, ¿qué piensa la OIT de que se incluya en estos tratados de libre comercio las referencias a los derechos fundamentales previstos por la OIT? ¿Es una buena cosa o no?
La OIT ha hecho una cantidad de estudios muy grandes en donde analiza no solo las experiencias, sino que los impactos que se ha tenido por la inclusión de estas cláusulas o capítulos laborales en los tratados de libre comercio. La evidencia nos muestra que han sido efectivos, que han sido útiles para promover no solamente el reconocimiento de ciertos derechos, sino que al mismo tiempo también garantizar mecanismos de protección o mecanismos, inclusive, si me permiten el término, donde se puede ejercer cierta presión política para el cumplimiento y la puesta en marcha de estos convenios. Hay experiencias, hay casos inclusive previos a estos tratados de libre comercio. Hay países en la región que todavía están bajo sistemas del SGP+, por ejemplo, Bolivia está todavía en esos términos con la Unión Europea. Y lo tenía Centroamérica en su momento, digamos, la conversación que se tenía en función de los beneficios económicos de estos tratados comerciales, llegaron inclusive unos países a ratificar convenios que ni siquiera lo habían contemplado, convenios fundamentales que ni siquiera lo habían contemplado. Allí, déjenme hacer una referencia menos jurídica, pero más práctica. De alguna manera, cuando estamos hablando sobre esto, como estamos sido educados muchos y muchas de acá, es como encontrar ver el mundo como muy segmentado y vernos incluso nosotros muy segmentados, desde la herencia griega occidental de alma-cuerpo, desde la visión de la dicotomía entre una cosa y otra, y mirábamos que cada área de nuestra vida era como iba por carriles separados. El derecho laboral por un lado, todo el tema de comercio por otro lado. Y que parece ser que en algunos espacios, no digo no digo ahora, pero en algunos espacios cuando uno comenzaba a hablar, o cuando yo comenzaba a hablar hace, no sé, 10, 15 años sobre esta necesidad de interrelación y conversación, parecía que en el discurso uno estaba, si me permiten el término, ensuciando los principios de derecho laboral cuando hablaba sobre los temas comerciales. Y había esta preocupación y había este freno en diferentes momentos. Me acuerdo en Colombia, cuando estaba negociándose inclusive el Tratado de Libre Comercio con Estados Unidos, y cuando se firmó este acuerdo Obama-Santos del 2011, si no me recuerdo, y que hubo de alguna manera voces en contra de la firma de ese acuerdo. Y yo quiero recordar que el acuerdo Obama-Santos lo que recoge en ese momento, en 2011, es casi literalmente las recomendaciones que la misión de alto nivel de la OIT que visitó Colombia en el 2010 hizo. Y que de alguna manera puso sobre este tapete la necesidad de dar cumplimiento a esas recomendaciones de la OIT en los procesos. Ya no hablamos solo sobre derechos fundamentales, estamos hablando sobre un conjunto de recomendaciones que tenían que ponerse y que tenían que ver con la gobernanza interna del mercado de trabajo, pero también con mecanismos de garantía para el ejercicio de esos derechos. Luego hay mucha evidencia que nos ha mostrado efectivamente cómo estos sistemas de control que existen en los tratados de libre comercio son utilizados por el movimiento sindical de Perú, de Colombia, de los países de Ecuador, de los países en donde por lo menos los tres países que están bajo mi responsabilidad y que conozco, han sido utilizados como un mecanismo de presión y un mecanismo de demanda para este diálogo frente al Estado, exigiendo el cumplimiento del Estado de estos derechos fundamentales. Más aún, y sé que no es exactamente el Tratado de Libre Comercio, pero ponerlo sobre la mesa cuando se están hablando de estos acuerdos de la OECD, cuando se habló en Colombia, también se volvió a retomar el tema, y lo mismo en el caso peruano en este momento, también se retoma el tema. Entonces, hay que ver esto como, por llamado es un poco ver esto como una integralidad de nuestra sociedad y cómo efectivamente saber utilizar los instrumentos que nos brindan los diferentes espacios, no solo el espacio de derechos humanos, no solo el espacio de la OIT, sino que todos los espacios fundamentalmente para impulsar las garantías, pero sobre todo la vigencia de los derechos fundamentales y un poco más. No solo los derechos fundamentales, pero hablar sobre las condiciones habilitantes que promueven, por ejemplo, que permiten el ejercicio de la libertad sindical y que permiten el ejercicio de la negociación colectiva y que permiten entonces la mejora de condiciones de trabajo en cada uno de los países.
Sí, estoy de acuerdo. Este es mi tema de doctorado y cuando estaba empezando a revisar la literatura, efectivamente, el debate hace 15 años es si había o no una relación entre estas dos materias. Y hoy en día ese debate ya es superado y la cuestión ahora es el cómo. ¿Cómo hacer para que se garanticen realmente estos derechos? Y quiero pasar al profesor López para preguntarle. Porque en Europa se critica mucho la manera en que Europa ha diseñado la aplicación de estos derechos en un sentido que es un sistema de cooperación, de diálogo. Así que mi pregunta es, ¿deberían esos mecanismos ir más allá de únicamente el diálogo para asegurar una aplicación efectiva? Debería haber sanciones más fuertes, amenazas con levantar las tariffs o un enfoque híbrido. ¿Qué opina usted?
Bueno, pues muy buenos días a todos y todas. Muchas gracias también por esta invitación. Em, yo creo que el tema es supremamente interesante, como muy bien lo decía Ítalo y como muy bien lo introduces. Yo creo que ha habido un avance muy importante en lo que también entiendo que comparte Ítalo, y es que el mundo laboral ha venido cada vez más entendiéndose como un mundo que hace parte de la actividad productiva global. Y yo creo que eso es un avance muy importante que ha abierto los acuerdos comerciales. Es decir, el mundo laboral o el mundo de las relaciones laborales no es un asunto únicamente de un empleador con su trabajador. Eso es un asunto de cómo se está produciendo globalmente en general las actividades. Ni siquiera es un asunto nacional. Mucho menos es un asunto de empresa o de sector. Esto es un asunto de dinámicas globales. Yo creo que en eso, en esa ampliación de la visión de los problemas laborales, los acuerdos comerciales han hecho un avance supremamente importante. Creo que en ese sentido los acuerdos comerciales, y voy a tu pregunta, han venido generando un decir de esa realidad que expone un fenómeno global y que expone un riesgo reconocido. El riesgo que reconocen los acuerdos comerciales es que si bien lo que se pretende es desarrollo económico y aparejado un desarrollo social, pues lamentablemente lo que pasa en muchos casos es que los acuerdos comerciales generan un efecto inverso, y es que se empiezan a deteriorar condiciones laborales de un lado, o de otro lado se generan condiciones laborales que no son completamente deseables. Es decir, tenemos un avance muy importante en la aproximación del fenómeno, pero creo que también hay que aproximarnos a tratar de diferenciar qué dice el derecho, qué dicen los acuerdos comerciales y qué hace el derecho, o qué pasa, digamos, con ocasión de los acuerdos comerciales. Yo creo que hoy estamos entrando más en ese debate de qué es lo que hace, no qué es lo que dice. Yo creo que en lo que dice hemos avanzado muchísimo. Y en lo que hace viene la pregunta de, ya sabemos que lo que hace es generar a veces en muchos sectores condiciones de precarización laboral, o generaciones de empleo que no son completamente deseables desde los estándares incluso que menciona Ítalo, pero ¿cómo los controlamos o cómo evitamos esto? Nosotros desde el Observatorio Laboral de la Universidad Javeriana tenemos una perspectiva y es que el enfoque no puede estar únicamente en sanciones. Hay un problema previo y es que el derecho produce la pregunta sobre la justicia. Y la pregunta sobre la justicia que se está haciendo acá lleva a una consecuencia y es que se vuelve imposible la justicia laboral. Me explico. Los tratados y los acuerdos comerciales sancionan las conductas individuales de las empresas tendientes a desmejorar las condiciones laborales, tendientes a afectar el derecho de asociación sindical, pero sigue dándose una aproximación individual de actores, empresas, estados, cuando quizás el problema de fondo no es un problema de actores, es un problema sistémico. Y por lo tanto la visión jurídica no puede ser una visión de responsabilidad subjetiva. Y esto lo digo también un poco como un abogado que no solamente está en la academia, sino que está en el mundo de los negocios entendiendo las empresas. Y es muy difícil encontrar una empresa a la cual uno le pueda endilgar una estrategia malintencionada de precarizar condiciones laborales o una estrategia de yo quiero, por supuesto que habrán algunas, no digo que no. Y en eso creo que hemos avanzado en sanciones. Pero hay muchas empresas que no tienen un plan ni una estrategia de voy a acabar una organización sindical, voy a precarizar condiciones laborales, pero que invisiblemente o implícitamente terminan en esa lógica. Y creo que hacia ese efecto es el que jurídicamente no hemos podido empezar a darle forma en los acuerdos comerciales. Más allá de una responsabilidad subjetiva, lo que tenemos es un fenómeno sistémico y por lo tanto tenemos que empezar a pensar no solamente en sanciones, sino en cómo le damos forma jurídica a una injusticia que no depende del dolo ni de la culpa de los actores. Y ese creo que es uno de los principales retos que ahora tenemos en acuerdos comerciales, además para darle más efectividad, porque podemos generar sanciones muy gravosas, pero poder llegar a la conclusión de la responsabilidad se vuelve prácticamente imposible.
Gracias por esa perspectiva. No sé si no me pongo esto, creo que Cristina no me escucha. And I would like to turn to Christina now to know the European perception on this matter, which is in the EU, there is a criticism of the way the EU is trying to enforce the TSD chapters. Do you think dialogue-based system is the good one? Do you think it should be sanction-based? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
One second. We're not hearing you.
Okay, you're not hearing me. Okay.
I'll let you know when it's
I can try using another microphone. Do you hear me now? Oh dear.
No, I think voice meter was better. Can you try now?
I can try again. Does it work? No?
Así como, ¿dónde se oye?
No, it's fine. We're trying to solve it. No, I think it's here. Don't worry. It's here. We're trying to solve it.
Okay.
If you don't mind, Christina, we will continue the debate here and I'll get back to you when they solve the hearing problem. So, volvamos entonces a español. Y usted mencionaba brevemente que la OIT ha constatado que la inclusión de estas cláusulas en los tratados de libre comercio sí ha tenido un impacto positivo. ¿Será que nos puede ilustrar más sobre casos concretos, si posible en el contexto colombiano?
Mira, yo creo que hay Hay unos ejemplos interesantes, sobre todo el de la adopción de normas, el cambio de la normativa, el ajuste de la normativa que se ha dado, el reforzamiento de la capacidad institucional muchas veces frente a cómo mejora la capacidad de supervisión del cumplimiento de estas obligaciones. Y ahí entonces me gusta mucho la reflexión que nos hacía Daniel. Y coincido con él cuando dice, es que tenemos un acuerdo, es decir, general, pero tenemos un acuerdo bastante amplio sobre el qué. O sea, a nadie, por lo menos dicho políticamente correcto, nadie va a decir, estoy en contra de la libertad sindical, estoy en contra de la negociación colectiva, de condiciones de seguridad y salud. No, no hay ese debate, por lo menos no público, sí, hay casos, pero no es público. Ah, pero sí hay un gran debate sobre, y ahí coincido contigo, o una gran necesidad sobre el tema de cómo hacerlo posible, cómo hacerlo vigente. Y allí quisiera señalar dos elementos que creo que son interesantes, son importantes, y el segundo yo sé que tiene su polémica y es interesante porque el mundo académico se nutre de las polémicas. El primero es el tema de la gobernanza, y es lo que decía, cuando la OIT aprueba la Declaración del 98 sobre derechos fundamentales, 10 años después aprueba la Declaración de Justicia Social en un mundo globalizado. Y fundamentalmente la reflexión que traslada es, aquello que dijimos en el 98 no va a ser posible si no invertimos en una mejora de la gobernanza. Y básicamente señala la gobernanza en tres pilares. Uno es en el diálogo social, y todas las condiciones que necesitan para el diálogo social y la construcción de acuerdos. Dos, fortalecer la capacidad de los estados de supervisar el cumplimiento, y ahí viene el debate, si quieres, inclusive filosófico, no solo de derechos, sino que efectivamente del tema de las sanciones, el uso de las sanciones, y generalmente las sanciones como un instrumento para promover el cumplimiento. Yo creo que ningún tratado de libre comercio ni ninguna legislación nacional debería celebrar, es mi parecer, creo que debería celebrar la imposición o la amplia imposición de multas. Deberíamos de celebrar el cumplimiento, ¿ya? Si lo que tenemos es una gran cantidad de multas, habría que ver qué está faltando para que el cumplimiento no sea efectivo, porque finalmente lo que termina impactando en mejorar o en asegurar las condiciones de trabajo o la vida de las personas es que las normas que se establezcan, este deber ser del derecho, se cumpla, se pone en marcha. Pero la segunda es supervisión del cumplimiento y la tercera es sobre las políticas que los estados tienen que implementar, es decir, el rol del Estado en las políticas públicas, el rol del Estado en el mercado de trabajo, que en algunos países todavía se cuestiona. Recientemente ha habido un neo-cuestionamiento del rol del Estado en el mercado de trabajo. Entonces, son esos tres elementos que se da, pero luego también la OIT hace una declaración que es el segundo salto, si quieren, o el segundo punto que creo que puede generar el debate, es el rol de las empresas multinacionales en la promoción del cumplimiento. Y ahí trastoca y mueve un poco el piso, porque entonces estamos hablando de este rol de las empresas multinacionales vis a vis el rol de los estados. Y en el caso, por ejemplo, de los tratados de libre comercio con la Unión Europea y mucho más con las reglas de la debida diligencia, que recientemente, bueno, ya existían antes, pero se están implementando en los países donde tiene comercio, el tema de las empresas multinacionales tiene un peso muy importante. Aunque no voy a decir nombres, en Colombia, por ejemplo, y uno de los ejemplos que se tenía es, hay un sector sector rural que que tiene uno de los productos de agroexportación de Colombia muy importantes y donde también los niveles de informalidad y los niveles de incumplimiento han sido muy amplios, donde la Inspección del Trabajo ha trabajado mucho en eso, ha implementado mucho, hemos venido acompañando, pero algo que ha ayudado a mover rápidamente es la participación de una empresa que lo que se encarga es de transportar este producto de Colombia a Europa y lo pone allá y lo vende allá. Pero para venderlo allá necesita cumplir con todas estas regulaciones que el derecho dice que deben de cumplirse. Y que entonces el mensaje efectivo es, ¿sabe qué? No voy a comprar o tengo que garantizar que efectivamente lo que yo estoy comercializando se produce en las condiciones que están establecidas por los derechos fundamentales, por la legislación nacional y por los estándares de debida diligencia. Y efectivamente no hay que reflexionar mucho sobre cuál va a ser el impacto de una empresa que quiere vender un producto y sobre todo ponerle en este caso en Europa, cuál es la mayor preocupación que tiene frente a una multa de inspección de trabajo o no poder vender el producto en donde está. Y entonces es el rol que tienen estas empresas multinacionales, y la OIT lo recoge en esta declaración de empresas multinacionales, que invito a leerla, y a replantear efectivamente cuál es este actor supraestatal, por supuesto, o fuera del Estado, por supuesto, pero que tiene también un rol importante en el cumplimiento de estos estándares y también genera un espacio de diálogo importante. Y ahí venía una reflexión adicional que tú hacías y que también coincido. Es que el lograr la vigencia de esto es una tarea también de multiactores, no solamente actores estatales y no solamente actores, en este caso, obviamente, el rol de los actores sindicales, pero también el rol del sector empresarial, y las empresas multinacionales juegan un rol importante. Por supuesto que tienen un cuestionamiento y por supuesto, de nuevo, puede haber este debate importante de eso. Lo que no se puede negar es lo que sucede y el rol que están jugando en temas como el que estaba señalando.
Sí, y de hecho, los tratados de la Unión Europea prevén lo que ellos llaman los Domestic Advisory Groups, que son estos espacios de diálogos. So, I will turn to Christina and I will give you two questions in one. And is the first one that I already made is that in the EU, there's a criticism regarding this dialogue-based system. So what do you think about it? Do you think it should be stronger? The EU should adopt a stronger approach? And if you could also tell us, how do these domestic advisory groups work and what could be changed, or something should be changed in order that what these domestic advisory groups advise is actually taking into account and has an impact in the governance of the labor rights in this free trade agreement?
Yes, thank you. First question, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Si ponemos
Not
Oh.
really,
si ponemos el
Oh, no.
micrófono
but
ya.
the technic is here. 1 second.
Okay. You don't hear me at all? No?
They're still working on it, sorry.
Okay.
¿Me funciona? Sí, yo sé, es contra la tecnología, pero es un poco por tratar de resolver, así como de...
And now it works, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. And let me take this opportunity to thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic panel. Yes, your question was about the criticism that there is, the whole approach of the EU and specifically the domestic advisory. Do you hear me? No? No? Now I don't hear you because you're muted. Okay. But do you hear me? Yes or no? I'm kind of confused because now I don't hear anything.
Yes.
Okay, now I hear you again. Okay, so the domestic advisory groups, so that was the main part of the question. I mean, I think they are a really, really central part of the EU's approach. They are also, it's also like the whole EU, the whole approach of the EU with its trade partners is, I think, to try and at least let this be a bilateral process in the best sense of the word for as much as this is possible. Because historically, you know, the EU has started with this whole trade and sustainability, with this whole idea of trade and sustainability, not with its trade partners in the free trade agreements, but actually with the developing countries, so at least specifically the least developed countries, where there's a huge power imbalance between the EU and those developing countries. So for them, trading with the EU is incredibly important, and for the EU, they are kind of replaceable. And that's where the EU started, you know, unilaterally imposing conditions, saying if you ratify international conventions on labor rights, on human rights, and on environmental protection, then you get better trade conditions. And this is completely unilateral. We're not asking you about your opinion at all. This is like how the EU started doing this with the developing countries. And then only relatively late, so in 2009, did the EU extend this kind of approach to its trade partners that are more on an equal level, I would say? I mean, there's rarely really an equal level between trade partners, but like more equal. And then the idea was really to, you know, not do it the same way, not have this kind of top-down approach that the EU is forcing, like unilaterally, the countries to do something. But the idea was that at least formally it should be a bilateral approach, and it should always very much focus on the stakeholders in the country itself, focus on the trade unions, the environmental organizations, the civil society organizations. My idea is, and I don't have the global bird's eye view of all the DAGs in all the countries, my feeling is that, you know, the trade agreements themselves very often don't go into too much details on how they should work. So how well they work and how much they can achieve very often depends on the practical implementation in the different countries. The one that we have the most information about, because there's been so much written about this case with Korea, is of course the EU-Korea case. And there, you know, the whole trade dispute that was eventually that emerged from this. So the EU has since until now only had one case in which it really went in a dispute with the country because of trade and sustainability issues. This emerged really from the DAG, absolutely, and it was the Korean Union. So there was a lot of cooperation between the European trade unions and the Korean trade unions. And there was also a long history of the Korean trade unions going to the ILO again and again and again. They were winning all of the cases against the government, and the government did not react to that. So there you had a case where you could say upfront, you know, the stakeholders on the ground, the ones that are perhaps best informed, best in the best place to judge whether or not intervention from outside is desirable or not. The trade unions, of course, there's not a huge unionization, but it's about 10%, like 12%, something like this. So, yeah, you know, they are somehow representative, and they very clearly communicated that they wanted the EU to intervene, because what they saw was that they have tried everything on the national level. The national courts don't help them. They have tried everything on the international level because the ILO is trying to help them, but they don't have the means. They're just issuing recommendation after recommendation after recommendation to the Korean government, and the Korean government is not reacting to that. And then they were basically going in this, you know, in this dialogue with the European unions, and eventually they repeatedly then asked the EU to do something over years and years, actually. So the first attempt was in 2013, and then in 2018, 5 years later, the EU eventually did what the unions asked it to do and brought a case which was also much narrower than the unions would have wanted it to. So my idea is a little bit that this is what really justifies, in a way, the intervention from outside, because, you know, if you don't have that, it's really so much of a unilateral process. If, you know, the EU is usually the bigger trade partner because it is one of the largest economic blocs that you have in the world. So this is extremely important, that you have some stakeholder involvement and that you don't interfere just as an outside actor that thinks it knows better what should be good for workers in the country. Yeah, that's a little bit my reaction. Now I don't hear you again.
Thank you, Christina. We know that you're an expert on the Korean case, and we would like to ask you a little bit later to tell us more about this panel report. But before that, I would like to turn to Professor Lopez with the same question. What do you think about this domestic, bueno, ¿qué piensa de estos grupos consultivos internos? Y si piensa que debe haber alguna reforma para que las recomendaciones que ellos hagan realmente sean tenidas en cuenta.
Bien, yo creo que, ahí está. Yo creo que hay múltiples retos y hay que empezar a caracterizarlos. Quizás hay un reto que tiene que ver con algunos grupos de trabajadores que no logran ni siquiera los estándares mínimos exigidos en una normatividad nacional. Y yo creo que en ese sentido estos grupos han logrado unos avances muy importantes, porque además han servido como un complemento a los estados nacionales para poder impulsar, digamos que algunos actores dentro de la cadena global de producción alcancen esos estándares mínimos. Yo creo que ahí hay un aspecto bien interesante. Pero creo que hay otro aspecto que nosotros también desde el Observatorio Laboral hemos venido resaltando que a nosotros en particular nos genera mucha preocupación. Hicimos un estudio sobre los últimos 20 años de las condiciones laborales colombianas y lo que demuestra el estudio cuantitativamente es que los salarios cada vez tienden más al mínimo. Y creemos que esto es un fenómeno que explica un poco una circunstancia distinta a los mínimos laborales que no se alcanzan. Es decir, en el umbral de el mínimo laboral hacia arriba, lo que un poco puede estar pasando con las cadenas globales de producción y los acuerdos comerciales es que los estándares o las condiciones laborales cada vez más llevan al mínimo. Y entonces, ¿cómo hacemos para que los trabajadores puedan no llegar al mínimo, sino mejorar? Y ahí es donde creemos que habrían dos aproximaciones que no parten desde, y ahí hay una limitación muy fuerte de los grupos locales. Porque este fenómeno se da porque en las cadenas hay por supuesto, un movimiento natural a que cada actor maximice sus beneficios y esto va generando entonces una especie de jerarquización invisible de los trabajadores en donde entre más lejos del vértice productivo, pues hay condiciones laborales que se acercan más al mínimo. Luego, no podemos resolver ese problema del mínimo desde el eslabón más pequeño. Tendríamos que resolver el problema de la tendencia hacia el mínimo en toda la cadena productiva. Y por lo tanto, los grupos locales son bastante limitados allí. Creo que en ese sentido, las organizaciones sindicales han demandado una estrategia y es permitir una sindicalización o un fortalecimiento de la sindicalización que permitan hacer negociaciones multinivel un poco en el sentido de que los beneficios económicos que se van distribuyendo a lo largo de la cadena puedan repercutir en los eslabones más débiles. Ciertamente eso es muy importante. Y ahí hay una limitación muy grande de los estados nacionales. Los estados nacionales no tienen las herramientas, no tienen necesariamente un rol para poder hacer una presión en toda la cadena productiva. Uno. Y por el otro lado hay una dificultad legal, y es que esta disminución de condiciones, pues tiene una forma completamente legítima desde el derecho. Yo quiero, por ejemplo, hacer mención a un estudio muy breve, voy a hacer una mención muy breve a un estudio que hicimos hace algún par de años, donde miramos los puertos de Colombia, todos los puertos de Colombia y las condiciones laborales. Y la verdad es que en la mayoría de la fragmentación productiva que genera la conexión a cadenas globales, pues hay formalidad y hay unas condiciones mínimos de cumplimiento. Es decir, ahí no podríamos decir que hay una ilegalidad manifiesta. Pero hay una imposibilidad de las organizaciones sindicales de poder generar un efecto transversal a lo largo de toda la cadena. Y eso también se genera en parte porque hay una invisibilización de qué es parte del eslabón es el que se está beneficiando de esto, de este movimiento natural, es decir, como una tendencia normal del mercado, pero es prácticamente imposible identificar cuál es el eslabón que tiene el mayor beneficio. Poder evidenciar cuál es el eslabón que tiene el mayor beneficio de esta tendencia, creo que podría haber debates sobre justicia interesantes. Y hacia allá, pues definitivamente creo que deberíamos movernos, más que a un debate de ilegalidad o legalidad, a un debate de quién es el que se beneficia de este movimiento que producen las cadenas globales de producción.
Ahora que hemos visto sobre estos Domestic Advisory Groups, me gustaría preguntarle al doctor Cardona qué rol juega la OIT en la supervisión o en el cumplimiento de las disposiciones laborales en los acuerdos de libre comercio. ¿Juega algún rol o como es una relación entre estados, la OIT no se inmiscuye?
A ver, hay diferentes niveles, ¿no? O sea, la OIT no es responsable de supervisar el cumplimiento de los capítulos laborales en los tratados de libre comercio, no es su rol directamente. Ahora, al momento que de los capítulos laborales hacen una referencia a la normativa de la OIT, por supuesto que hace de alguna manera, si quieren, referencia indirecta al rol que la OIT realiza de supervisión del cumplimiento de los derechos fundamentales en general. Y muchas veces las quejas, las demandas, las solicitudes que se hacen en el marco de los mecanismos que los tratados de libre comercio han establecido son similares a las demandas, a las quejas, a los comentarios que se establecen en los sistemas de control normativo de la OIT. Y en función de eso, hay muchas iniciativas que se están desarrollando en los países bajo los esquemas o bajo las herramientas que tiene el sistema de control normativo de la OIT que se aplican a los países y que nos llama, si quieren, nos llama a la actuación para revisar temas particulares. Uno de los temas particulares o el tema particular más recurrente es efectivamente las condiciones para el ejercicio de la libertad sindical, que es una condición habilitante, no solo un derecho, sino que una condición habilitante que permite el ejercicio de otros derechos laborales en cada uno de los países. Entonces, dedicamos mucho tiempo a eso y el otro de los temas importantes que está dentro de los pilares de gobernanza es los espacios de diálogo social. ¿Qué tan efectivos son los espacios de diálogo social y qué tanto esos espacios construyen acuerdos y construyen efectivamente unas líneas de acción para el cumplimiento, para la puesta en marcha de los compromisos que los países han establecido en los tratados de libre comercio? Por supuesto, también hay espacios de conversación, de diálogo que hacemos con la Unión Europea, particularmente con el área de comercio, que está dando mucho seguimiento a esos temas, hace estos foros regulares de revisión de países en los cuales participamos, no solamente en nuestra sede, sino que, por ejemplo, en mi oficina, para hablar sobre la situación de que tienen cada uno de los países en el cumplimiento de estas obligaciones. Y la Unión Europea particularmente en este diálogo también consulta mucho a la OIT las consideraciones que tenemos en el terreno sobre las preocupaciones que existen en los países y sobre las oportunidades también que existen en los países. Entonces también hay esta participación más informal en estos espacios de diálogo, porque no, la visión es cómo entre todos los actores que estamos vinculados directa o indirectamente al mundo del trabajo, el mundo del comercio, el mundo de cómo producimos en este momento, cómo nos relacionamos en estas esferas de producción, creo que este diálogo no solamente es útil, sino que es necesario. Y es el tema de que entendamos efectivamente que el tránsito de lo que antes era una economía globalizada a una economía hiperconectada, no solo digitalmente, tiene un impacto importante. Entonces, las condiciones de los trabajadores en Colombia no solo deberían de interesarle a los trabajadores, al gobierno de Colombia o las instituciones en Colombia, y no solo en la Unión Europea, sino que en el mundo en general, en la región, porque afecta a todos los demás países. Y esto no es nuevo. Si leemos la Constitución de la OIT hace 106 años, en la Constitución de la OIT señalaba, si quieren desde la visión muy eurocéntrica, pero que anunciaba algo de que efectivamente si había algún país que no cumplía con estas regulaciones, afectaba a los demás países y tiene un impacto a los demás países por el relacionamiento comercial o el relacionamiento de producción que en ese momento había, hace 106 años. Imagínate ahora lo que significa efectivamente en estas economías, como digo, hiperconectadas y el rol que tenemos entonces a partir de ello. Entonces, lo que estamos impulsando es cómo abrimos este diálogo, cómo abrimos esta conversación en los diferentes espacios para lograr el objetivo común, que efectivamente es la puesta en marcha o la vigencia efectiva más allá de los derechos fundamentales, pero efectivamente las regulaciones que ha establecido el derecho internacional en nuestro caso y, por supuesto, los derechos nacionales en el tema laboral.
Sí, y bueno, los tratados de libre comercio pues, que firma la Unión Europea tienen previsto que precisamente cuando ese diálogo social y esas concertaciones entre los gobiernos no funcionan, pueden tener recursos a lo que llaman un panel de expertos para que no una sentencia, pero es una decisión que igualmente no tiene poder de sanción, pero que sí pues tiene una consecuencias jurídicas. Y el único caso que ha habido en estos tratados de libre comercio, como lo mencionó Cristina, fue el caso de EU-Korea. Entonces, I would like that Cristina present us what was this case about, what the panel report said, and perhaps what can we then here discuss what lessons we can learn from the Korean case to the Latin American reality. I know you have a presentation, so perhaps you can share it.
I'll try sharing it. Let me see. Yep. Let's see whether that works. Oh. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, that's fine. Do you want it to be like 10 minutes, if I remember correctly? Something like that? Or should it be shorter?
No, it's fine.
Fine, okay. Yes, so this is a little bit a short form of a much longer research that we have conducted a few years ago, me and a few colleagues also. Specifically, so a little bit broader on the sustainability clauses and what we can learn about their effectiveness, specifically from the Korea case. And I will zoom in immediately, basically, on the parts that have to do with the EU-Korea case. So basically, internationally, trade disputes that have to do with sustainability clauses are extremely rare. So you might know that the EU is internationally known as, let's say, the second most active actor when it comes to trade and sustainability. The US is basically known as the most active, probably. So the US has been doing this a little bit longer than the EU. Already back in the 90s, and the EU has only started in about 2009, so concretely in 2009, with Korea also being the first trade agreement where you have a specific trade and sustainability chapter, as we've been talking about them. So since then, of course, also most of the trade agreements around the world now have this chapter. Those that are still older than 2009 do not have it. And when we look internationally, basically before the EU started off its first and only up until now trade dispute that had to do with sustainability, we had only one case internationally, because also the US, which is basically the one that kind of invented the whole concept of trade and sustainability, also the US is in practice not that likely to bring claims against countries and to even mention sustainability aspects in relation to other countries. The US has basically done this, like they even started conversations or even started any kind of debate about sustainability issues in 8 cases up until now. Most of them stopped with the first discussions, and very often they had no outcome, or the US said it had some kind of outcome. Actually, many of them concerned Latin American countries. The only case that really made it to the state where there was a panel set up in the US, this case, was the US Guatemala case, and that was like the one precedent that we could look at, and that was lost by the US. So the panel in that case found really that there was not enough evidence that Guatemala had violated its duties under the agreement, and the main reason for that, and that's the only thing I want to mention here, the main reason for that was that the panel said, in order to prove that there is a violation of a trade agreement, you would need to show that the US firms are really suffering under the unfair competition of those companies in the Guatemalan economy that are abusing labor rights. Otherwise, there's no way that you can invoke this. So you have to prove that it's really affecting trade. So in a manner affecting trade, that's something that you always have in the US agreements. And after that, it was there was silence. So in the US area, nothing happened. Now the EU also, and that's how I come to the next slide, hopefully. Yeah. The EU also has this kind of idea that something has to be trade related. So also the EU was very skeptical about bringing these kinds of claims. But in the end, as I told you, there was a very, very strong request from the DAG and also from the European Parliament to do something specifically in the Korean case. Also because Korea is basically a very rich country where the problems are not that, you are so underdeveloped and you can't protect labor rights. The problem was really that you had a government that had the view that, labor rights are very, very much limited and much more limited than the ILO would allow. So in the Korean case, it was really, so the whole case was construed very differently from what we've seen from the US side so far. So the US side is usually about a country not implementing its own labor law. So that is their problem usually, that they say you have perfect labor laws, because, I mean, to be honest, the most countries have a much stricter labor law than the US itself. And the US's problem with that was usually more that they did not implement their own labor law, so to say. For the EU, the approach is completely different. The EU says we are not arguing about your national labor law at all. For us, the treaties are really about the ILO's minimum fundamental labor rights that we have internationally, and that's all we want. We want, with our trade agreements, that both sides commit to those minimum standards internationally, the fundamental labor rights. Yes, and in the case of Korea, as I already mentioned before, there have been so many cases before the ILO, all brought by the Korean trade union movement. They were all about, a very restrictive approach to collective labor rights, like strike action is usually penalized. There's also criminal charges for obstruction of business. So although there's no violence in those strikes, the very idea that you're obstructing business is already criminalized. A refusal to register or a decision to deregister trade unions, and even threats. This kind of stuff has been before the ILO very, very often. And then the rest I've basically told you. So it's in 2019 that the claim is brought, and in 2021 the decision is handed down. So that's basically how it works. And the EU was basically halfway successful with its claims. So some of the claims that the EU brought were considered well-founded by the panel. So the panel of experts, that's basically just 3 experts. One is nominated by the EU, one is nominated by the other partner, so in that case, Korea. And the third is a neutral chairperson that both have to agree on. So that's how these panels look like. And they handed down a unanimous decision, which was also very important, that also the Korean panel member was completely on board with that decision, also the EU, so that the EU kind of won halfway, all of them were on board. And what did they find? They basically found that there were violations of international labor law, especially because Korea constructed the concept of worker very, very narrowly. And when a union had people on board that were unemployed or self-employed under the Korean system, the whole trade union was considered illegal. They were deregistered, decertified, things like this. So that was the main point that they had, that you have to allow collective labor rights also for people who don't have a job, and also for the self-employed. Very interesting point from an EU point of view. What they didn't, they also lost a few points. The most important point they lost, so that the EU lost, was the duty to ratify the ILO's core conventions. And that's also a typical kind of clause that you find in these trade agreements, that both sides commit to doing their best, basically, and to bring, to make efforts to ratify the EU's core conventions, which is, of course, again, a basically unilateral thing, because all of the EU member states have already ratified those conventions. So it's really more on the other side. And Korea had ratified 4 of them already before the trade agreement, and they did not ratify any more during these 10 years. Which then resulted in the panel saying, well, obviously the Korean efforts have been less than optimal, but there had been some efforts. So they had brought it before the parliament, and the parliament had said no, and this can simply happen in a democratic country. So that the panel said, well, this point we do not find well-founded. So that's approximately the decision of the panel. And then I would point out 2 things. So 2 things I would say are very important about this decision, which is why we basically say this is a very important decision. The first concerns what I told you about the US-Guatemala case, that it was lost basically because the panel found that you need to prove that it's trade-related, that you need to prove that it has an impact on the competitiveness of US firms, that labor rights are violated in Guatemala, and that is kind of very, very difficult to prove. The EU panel took a completely different view, and also the EU took a different approach. So it didn't even claim that there were any repercussions on European firms. It just said, we have concluded an agreement, and we said that labor rights are part of it. And therefore, it's just a matter of principle that you have to comply with those labor rights, and we shouldn't have to prove that it has any impact on our companies. And that was, the panel agreed to that point. So that was a very important point, that the panel agreed on this and said, these agreements are about more than just trade. They just integrated fundamental rights as something that is the basis of the agreement itself. So if one of the parties doesn't stick to them, then that is as such a violation. And the second point that I find very important is that it completely trusts the ILO with defining what the fundamental labor rights are. So it's not trying to, interfere with the internal law of Korea at all. It's just saying, well, basically, we will take over all that we have in the ILO's constitution and also in the Declaration of Fundamental Rights, which is also mentioned in these agreements always. And we will also look at the Committee of Freedom of Association, everything that it has said about Korea, and thereby we can find basically that there was a violation, because that is what the Committee of Freedom of Association has said many times. So it's really focusing very much on the ILO and also stressing the point that it's not for the EU to decide what labor rights are, it's completely for the ILO to decide as the expert body what those rights should be. Now, very briefly, we have studied the aftermath in Korea, whether it really had an impact, because if you read documents published by the EU, they're usually very optimistic. They're saying everything is bright now and Korea is going to change everything and we have been so successful. Yes, on the ground, things look very differently, in fact. So if you look a little bit below the surface, we had, in fact, so it's true that something changed because Korea then ratified 3 of the fundamental conventions. So there's now only 1 that they did not ratify. But that's basically the point that the EU lost, as I told you before. So that's not a reaction to the judgment. That's basically something that was going on because Korea then had a very labor-friendly government that also definitely contributed to the fact that this panel could work so successfully, because Korea was extremely cooperative at that time. And then there were elections, and then Korea had a very different administration, and then all the legislation that has been proposed was just vetoed by that new president that is now impeached. You might have heard about that. And that was it, basically. So there were no reforms going on. They now have ratified a few more conventions. But I've talked to trade unions a lot in Korea, and they basically tell me that on the ground, nothing has changed because the courts interpret conventions as not being above national law, which means that they see it as kind of equal to national law, and national law is more detailed. So they prefer to just stick to the old case law. So not much has changed on the grounds, and the Korean unions just keep going to the ILO and winning. So like the situation is not really much different from what it has been before. So I will not talk a lot about the lessons learned because we can develop that in a dialogue afterwards. One of the points that I'm always stressing with this case is that it was really a kind of a missed opportunity, because what the EU was bringing here, so the claim itself, the first and one of the main claims was about the fact that in Korea, the self-employed were not able to become union members. Now, in the EU, that's usually not a problem. The self-employed in most countries can become union members, but they can very often not bargain collectively. So that would have been a wonderful opportunity for Korea to say, I will bring a counterclaim, basically, and make this a real two-sided process and not something that is completely unilateral, where the EU tells Korea what to do. And it would have had the chance to also improve something in the EU, but unfortunately the Korean negotiators were probably not really up to speed on what is going on in the EU, so they kind of missed this chance, and it would have been a completely different case if it was two-sided and also the EU was subject to scrutiny on something where the EU is probably also not 100% in line with international labor standards. So that's a very interesting point to me. Yes, and I would leave the discussion then to the common panel. Thank you very much.
Por esa explicación de lo que fue el caso de Corea, y efectivamente hace algunos meses conocí a un director de unidad del DG Trade, del directorado de comercio de la comisión, al cual le pregunté que por qué no habían vuelto a recurrir a los paneles, y me respondió con honestidad porque no están muy seguros que van a ganar. Y me hizo valer que de la innovación, la nueva innovación de la comisión, que es lo que ellos llaman el Single Entry Point o punto único de entrada, que es un avance administrativo en el cual ahora cualquier stakeholder interesado que esté basado en la Unión Europea puede presentar un caso para que la comisión lo estudie y decida si quiere iniciar un diálogo, si quiere irse a un panel. Esta innovación vino después de una revisión que se fomentó desde el Parlamento Europeo en el 2018 y fue incorporada en 2020. Y el primer caso en el que se empleó este mecanismo, que sabemos que hubo una publicación, fue en 2022, sindicatos de El Cerrejón y de una mina en Perú, gracias a la representación de un sindicato en Holanda, porque ellos no pueden, este sistema administrativo está diseñado es para que los actores basados en Europa puedan presentar una queja. Los actores latinoamericanos no pueden presentarla directamente, entonces tienen que pasar por un partner en Europa. Esta queja dio lugar a que este año la comisión publicara la queja y presentara una hoja de ruta de reformas en el caso de Perú. En el caso de Colombia no hay nada y pregunté también por qué y me dicen que es porque están esperando la implementación de la reforma laboral en Colombia. Y de nuevo pienso que es un poco lo que dice Cristina, que los europeos tienden a ser muy optimistas o sobrevaluar el impacto que tiene esto, porque cuando leí la reforma, pues muy poco tiene que ver con la queja inicial. La queja inicial es sobre los mineros que son contratados por contratos de prestación de servicios, no contratos laborales, y por ende reciben salarios diferentes a las personas que ejercen el mismo cargo, pero que sí tienen un contrato laboral y también que no se les reconoce el derecho de asociación. Sin embargo, a mí me sorprendió mucho cuando vi la hoja de ruta con Perú, en la que le proponen a Perú una serie de cambios del sistema general. Va desde, bueno, la formalización laboral, que sí tiene que ver con la queja inicial, pero también va con trabajo infantil, siendo que no tenía nada que ver con la queja, la libertad de asociación, cómo debería reformar Perú las inspecciones de trabajo, etc. Y si bien es cierto que, como decía, nadie va a decir que no son objetivos loables estos, sí se puede interrogar uno sobre la intervención extranjera en la soberanía nacional de cómo regulan pues el derecho laboral interno. También estos sindicatos, en vez de pasar por los jueces colombianos y después llegar a una decisión de la Corte Suprema, pues prefieren pasar, evitar los canales internos y pasar por estos mecanismos internacionales que tal vez puedan lograr más presión. Entonces le quiero preguntar acá a los presentes, uno, ¿qué piensan que podemos aprender de ese caso Coreo y qué piensan de esta innovación del Single Entry Point? Precisamente gracias a que ya tenemos un caso aplicado en Latinoamérica.
Bien, muchas gracias. Nuevamente creo que acá lo que vamos a ver qué pasa. Es decir, es una experiencia nueva que todavía no se ha desarrollado completamente, luego no podemos juzgarla aún. Sin embargo, yo creo anticiparme un poco a que vamos a tener toda una serie de obstáculos jurídicos que evidenció un poco incluso en la reforma laboral de la que hablabas ahora en Colombia. El motivo por el cual o digamos, uno de los temas centrales de la discusión sobre intermediación y tercerización laboral en Colombia es que las empresas tienen capacidades diferenciadas. Y entonces hay que tener mucho cuidado porque, pues, el fenómeno no es tan sencillo como comparar el trabajador de una empresa o un contratista con el trabajador de la gran empresa. Por supuesto que tienen condiciones distintas, pero la pequeña empresa o la mediana empresa podría asumir acaso las condiciones de la gran empresa. ¿Es ilegítimo acaso que exista una pequeña empresa o una mediana empresa participando de alguna manera en el ciclo de producción? Solamente deberían ser las grandes empresas. Vamos a prohibir entonces que las pequeñas y las medianas puedan contratar también. Es decir, jurídicamente se vuelve una maraña pues muy difícil de resolver, porque no hay nada ilegítimo en eso. El único problema de fondo es que legítimamente lo que hay es una estructura de proliferación de eslabones que de fondo lo que genera es menores condiciones laborales y posiblemente un incremento de beneficios de algunos eslabones. Pero eso ilegal no es. Eso, si se quiere, es un problema de justicia material, pero no de ilegalidad. Y jurídicamente en Colombia, y probablemente va a pasar lo mismo en, en Perú, los jueces nacionales no van a poder concluir nada ilegal ahí. Y una constatación incluso con los acuerdos comerciales tampoco va a llevar a un problema de ilegalidad o de vulneración. Eh, el problema va más allá de las actuales formas jurídicas que le damos al problema. El problema va a poder plantear que la justicia laboral es también un problema de cómo se distribuyen los beneficios que produce la cadena de valor, no un tema simplemente de aplicación de normas.
¿Quiere ponernos su opinión?
Bueno, quizás un par de reflexiones que van en la misma línea, ¿no? Es decir, efectivamente que el fortalecimiento de los mecanismos internos que de alguna manera promueven o garantizan el cumplimiento de las normas, no solamente la normativa nacional, sino que la normativa internacional vigente es claramente, fortalecerla es una necesidad, pero también es un enfoque diversificado de abordaje. Por supuesto que uno entiende que la protección, por ejemplo, de los derechos laborales le corresponde a la inspección de trabajo, pero no solo es la inspección de trabajo. El rol del sistema judicial, el rol de los jueces es clave para poder avanzar en eso. Por eso que trabajamos nosotros muchísimo con las cortes, no solamente para que los jueces conozcan sobre las normas internacionales, sino que tengan las herramientas para saber aplicarlas. Y por supuesto, hay otros actores dentro del Estado que tienen un rol importante y que es como transversalizas esta visión de la necesidad de cumplir con el objetivo de la norma, un poco con el objetivo de la norma nacional e internacional, pero con el objetivo que quieres desarrollar. Y luego el otro tema que abordaste, que también quisiera hacer alguna referencia eh, sobre el cumplimiento o no de la legalidad. Siempre los que hemos estudiado, o los que estudian derecho, siempre hemos visto que el desarrollo jurídico, el desarrollo normativo tiene una velocidad distinta a lo que siempre ha tenido la realidad. Y ha habido todo un debate filosófico alrededor de eso. Pero si vemos actualmente sobre la velocidad que están pasando los cambios, es que ya nos quedamos muchísimo atrás. El debate sobre la mera legislación pareciera que un debate de una década atrás, aunque no lo fuera, aunque acá recién se acaba de aprobar una reforma que finalmente no pudo pasar, temas políticos, si uno lo entiende, todo un capítulo enorme sobre derechos colectivos y una conversación sobre derechos colectivos. Yo lo que siempre he dicho en todos los espacios, sindicales, empresariales, con gobierno, etcétera, que si algo hizo bien, o si un buen efecto que que hizo el proceso de reforma laboral en Colombia, es que puso a hablar casi a todo el país sobre el tema laboral y sobre la necesidad de entender el tema laboral. Pero aunque no haya pasado por una aprobación del Congreso, yo creo que Colombia no solamente merece, sino que necesita un diálogo sobre relaciones colectivas en el trabajo. Y no estoy hablando de un debate en el Congreso, que el Congreso decidirá y tiene la potestad para decir si la toma o no. Pero al margen de eso, hay una conversación necesaria sobre cuáles deberían de ser de nuevo de alguna manera, si quieren, los acuerdos de gobernanza y los acuerdos hacia dónde vamos a ir para poder avanzar de una manera que a veces la legislación misma no lo permite. Y en ese sentido, la negociación colectiva abre espacios muy importantes. Tú mencionaste la negociación colectiva anteriormente por rama de actividad, que es algo que hay un deber de promoción y hay un deber, por supuesto, del Estado, de la OIT, de promoverlo. sin desconocer que la negociación colectiva es un ejercicio voluntario de las partes y que debe respetarse la voluntariedad de en qué nivel deben de negociar colectivamente. Pero no debe dejarse por fuera de la herramienta que significa de avanzar. Fundamentalmente, estos espacios, los espacios que crean los tratados de libre comercio, los espacios que estamos de alguna manera promoviendo es darle valor al diálogo. Y parece que eso está devaluado. Pero lo que no está devaluado es la necesidad urgente que tenemos como, de alguna manera, como países, como colectividades, de reconstruir un tejido que nos permita avanzar en algo que adolecemos, que es la cohesión social. Y cómo efectivamente empezamos a construir entre personas que pensamos diferentes, entre personas que somos diversas, pero vamos construyendo un objetivo común hacia donde avanzar. Yo creo que ese es el reto fundamental de esos espacios de diálogo y que tiene que ver con los tratados de libre comercio, pero tiene que ver con la construcción misma de la sociedad y sus derechos. Entonces, sí, dije que es un debate que quizás va más allá de la legalidad y va más allá de los sistemas de control de la OIT, sí, pero sí está como un elemento de base para la construcción de una gobernanza que haga posible que todas estas declaraciones que hay de derechos fundamentales, de marcos laborales en los tratados de libre comercio, finalmente se hagan realidad y finalmente estemos convencidos y convencidas de que efectivamente es la ruta que debemos de avanzar y tenemos que transitar. Y en ese sentido yo creo que como reflexión de cierre en esto, no debemos de perder de vista que estos espacios de diálogo, los espacios de supervisión, el tema que hablábamos de sanciones o multas son herramientas para poder construir este cumplimiento que queremos. A veces nos enamoramos de las herramientas y a veces pensamos que una herramienta nos sirve para cualquier cosa y no es así. Y yo creo que también debe darse un espacio para discutir qué herramientas son las que en este momento necesita el sistema de gobernanza del mercado de trabajo, el sistema de cumplimiento de los capítulos laborales en los tratados de libre comercio y animarse a dar un diálogo político sobre ese tema.
Bueno, les propongo que entonces incorporemos ya este consejo y abramos el diálogo acá con los asistentes. Si alguno tiene preguntas o comentarios.
Claro, claro.
Hola, hola. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por las presentaciones, fueron muy interesantes, muy ilustrativas para aquellos que no venimos del campo del derecho del trabajo. Pero hay algo que me interesa particularmente, me llamó mucho la atención, que surgió en parte en la presentación de Cristina y en algunos comentarios de ustedes, que tiene que ver con el rol de el amplio y cada vez más grande sector de los trabajadores autónomos, o como hemos llamado tradicionalmente en América Latina, el trabajo informal, ¿no? Digamos que hay una parte del mercado laboral en América Latina que estructuralmente ha estado explicado por los trabajadores informales, aquellos que no están integrados al sistema formal de impuestos, de cargas sociales, y que por consiguiente han tenido muchas dificultades para encontrar espacios de asociación y caer y ser protegidos bajo la órbita de los clásicos y tradicionales sindicatos. Pero también tengo la sensación de que ante esa cuestión tan estructural y que viene de muchas décadas en América Latina y de sus características y sus desafíos en su inserción en la División Internacional del Trabajo, que también hay un nuevo mercado laboral a nivel internacional, producto de la emergencia de las plataformas y un montón de otras prácticas, donde ese amplio sector cada vez es más amplio, en vez de ser cada vez más reducido. Y ustedes en muchos casos hicieron referencia a la cuestión sobre cómo favorecer un diálogo entre los diferentes actores de esta conversación. Entonces la pregunta que me hago y la pregunta que les quiero hacer a ustedes es, ¿hay algo de ese diálogo que pareciera estar anclado en una mirada muy del siglo XX, una mesa tripartita entre capital, sindicatos y Estado? Y la pregunta es cómo incorporar ese sector de trabajadores informales a esa conversación. Si la expectativa tiene que seguir siendo el de la sindicalización, o si tenemos que empezar a pensar en el reconocimiento de un cuarto actor en esa conversación y cómo podemos hacer para canalizar las necesidades de esos actores que tal vez ya no caigan en las categorías clásicas de lo como imaginamos a los sindicatos, sino que tienen características y dinámicas propias que nos impone lamentablemente las nuevas realidades del mercado de trabajo. Espero que se haya entendido la pregunta.
Ok. Sí, a ver, este es un fenómeno supremamente importante y coincido contigo en que cada vez es más creciente. Quizás una buena experiencia para tratar de pensarlo es el reciente diálogo social de UNIDAP, la unión de trabajadores de plataformas tecnológicas de Rappi y el acuerdo al que llegaron con Rappi. Con ocasión de, justamente, o no con ocasión, en paralelo a la discusión de la reforma laboral. Nosotros sí creemos que hay que hacer o que el sindicalismo desborde los límites de la relación laboral subordinada y entonces pensemos en un sindicalismo que más bien vaya a un concepto de trabajo como actividad humana productiva, con independencia de si hay subordinación, si es un algoritmo, si está en hacia... Esa es una alternativa y es romper los límites de la relación, digamos, subordinada típicamente industrial que funda las organizaciones sindicales. Pero eso es un movimiento que deben dar las organizaciones sindicales. Eso no se puede forzar. Son las organizaciones sindicales las que deberían poder decir, oiga, yo voy a empezar a pelear. Y ciertamente hay muchas que lo han hecho. O hay otro fenómeno como el de unidad, y es no nos encontramos representados en organizaciones sindicales, pero sí tenemos una forma de asociación, y esa forma de asociación debe encontrar un espacio para poder dar negociaciones colectivas, que es el ejemplo de unidad. Unidad tiene un acuerdo. En este segundo escenario, pues el reto jurídico es tremendo. Unidad, de hecho, a lo largo de todo el diálogo era, pero ¿esto qué es? Esto es una mesa de negociación. Aplicamos artículos del Código Sustantivo del Trabajo. ¿Cuál es el rol del ministerio acá? Eh, ¿Ustedes tienen personería jurídica? ¿Cómo se define la representatividad interna de ustedes? Hay muchos vacíos allí que habría que resolver. Pero hoy veo dos caminos o que la organización, la estructura del sindicalismo rompa su estructura clásica en términos de relación industrial, o que surjan nuevas formas como lo planteas un poco. En ambos casos debe haber negociación. La negociación es un básico acá.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta, es solo pertinente, es muy interesante el debate que se puede hacer ahí. Sobre lo primero que dijiste, lo primero, formalmente, seguro sabes, cuando hablamos de libertad sindical y ejercicio de asociatividad, por supuesto, cubre a todos los trabajadores, incluyendo los trabajadores autónomos o los trabajadores independientes. Y hay muchos sindicatos de trabajadores autónomos independientes, o hay muchos trabajadores autónomos o independientes dentro del movimiento sindical tradicional. No todos, pero sí hay un grupo de ellos. Y es importante lo que inicialmente señala sobre el tema de economía informal, la economía informal, y luego encontrar y entender la diversidad que encontramos dentro de la economía informal, inclusive la diversidad de la informalidad en América Latina. Por supuesto, uno no puede hablar lo mismo en Chile, donde la informalidad anda como el 30-33%, a Bolivia, que anda en el 88%, o Perú en el 76% más o menos. Y por supuesto después Colombia un poquito arriba de los 50, rondando los 60. Es decir, igual es muy heterogéneo en América Latina y hay diferentes sociedades que uno tiene que saber cómo va a abordar el tema y cómo lleva. Sin embargo, la conversación es muy interesante sobre el nivel de representatividad que este colectivo de trabajadores autónomos tiene dentro del movimiento sindical. Por supuesto, no todo la economía informal se caracteriza por trabajadores autónomos, tiene un peso importante. Y en algunos países, el caso peruano, porque en Perú hemos avanzado en este diálogo con el movimiento sindical y en la creación de una mesa de trabajadores autónomos con el gobierno, permite un poco establecer cuáles son estas marcos de relaciones y marco de negociaciones que ellos pueden establecer. Por supuesto, no es como no hay una relación laboral y por supuesto la negociación no es como una empresa tradicional, sino que una negociación muchas veces con el Estado o una negociación que busque crear una normativa que les cobije o que les incluya los sistemas de protección social en los países. Sí, es algo que todavía es un trabajo en progreso, un tema que todavía falta por avanzar, pero es un debate que creo que cada vez más está presente por los niveles, como digo, en cada uno de los países, la presencia que esto tiene. Sin duda alguna, el tema de la necesidad de escalar esta representación sindical y el diálogo mucho más allá de una relación laboral tradicional, cada vez más es una necesidad. Mencionabas el tema de las plataformas, y no solamente presenta el reto que señalabas de esto, sino que presenta el reto desde nuestra perspectiva también, la necesidad de que la información sea transparente para poder tomar decisiones sobre ello. Y ahí hay un enorme reto. Un enorme reto no solo en Colombia, pero lo hay en Colombia, sobre la necesidad de decir cuántos trabajadores hay en plataformas en Colombia. Es difícil saberlo. Y pero no porque no exista la data, es porque la data no es pública, porque pareciese ser que está como encriptado, guardada en un baúl que no pertenece a la opinión pública, y que entonces hace muy difícil la definición de políticas públicas o de acciones que favorezcan la organización sindical, la negociación, la cobertura y protección social. Y la OIT está haciendo este debate que tú sabes, en la Conferencia Internacional del Trabajo el año pasado, y lo va a dar ahora, sobre si se establece una regulación sobre el tema de plataformas, pero sobre todo plataformas de envíos, ¿no? Directamente. Pero hay muchas otras plataformas. Y hay mucho trabajo en plataformas que no le conocemos y que, por supuesto, va mucho más allá del tema inclusive de territorialidad de los países. Pues son personas trabajando para empresas que están ubicadas en países diversos a los que habitan. Entonces es un tema de una complejidad, y que urge de nuevo este debate sobre cómo vamos a actualizar las prácticas y la gobernanza en un mundo cambiante y un mundo con retos específicos, como señalaba en economía informal.
Christina, one of the questions we received here is regarding the informal workers that are not bound by any contract, labor contract, or even private contract. So the question is, if you want to say it in English, but what I understand.
How to bring them into the conversation between governments. Thank you, Christina. So the question is basically, how can we make to bring those workers that are informal workers that are not tied to the traditional kind of contracts that make them, let's say, susceptible of being unionized, but that also need to be represented in these conversations about labor clauses in free trade agreements, and how can we also sort of like channel their participation if traditional unions are still struggling to make them members of the classic ways of thinking about unions, let's say. I don't know if the question is clear.
Yes, thank you. I think there are no easy answers to that, and certainly we also don't have the easy answers anywhere in the EU, if you were hoping for that. Yes, like informal workers are a difficult group to unionize. There have been some successes in some sectors, especially with domestic work sometimes. The platform workers, I think, are a little bit of a different story, because very often they are not classic informal workers. Like sometimes they are, very often they are basically in illegal migrants, which also makes it very difficult. Very often they are there only for a restricted period. For many classic unions, it's really a difficulty to unionize them. Very often the system is also not built in order to enable that, and to count them also for the traditional bargaining process, because very often for the traditional bargaining process, the unions will have to prove that they are representative, and then you need to come forward with the official members, which is very difficult if you have informal members. So you have some traditional unions trying that, and other attempts were just, those informal workers themselves are building up something from the ground. If they are able to engage in some forms of industrial action, that of course, like we are seeing them and they are visible, but it's very, very rarely the case. And I don't think that in the DAGs that we have under the different FTAs at the moment, we have any union represented that would have a significant share of informal workers among their members. This is just not the case. The idea of the DAGs is, of course, that you should have the representative unions of the country. which is very often, you know, not necessarily including those relatively small unions that would unionize the informal workers. If they're unionized at all, so, you know, like the huge majority of them will not be unionized anyway. So how to get them represented in the trade agreements is already like a kind of additional question to the original one, which is how to get them unionized in the first place. So I would say that would already be very, very advanced to say that at some point they might be represented even in something that represents the whole union movement, like a DAG. So I think we're very far from that at the moment, and we certainly do not have the answers in the EU. Yeah.
Thank you, Cristina. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta en la sala? Si no, podemos dar por finalizado. ¿Sí?
Y toca eso, todo eso. Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por la presentación, a las personas que están en el panel. Bueno, yo quisiera como tratar de entender el problema. Lo veo como muy normativo, muy legal, que sirve aquí la ley, que no sirve la norma. Pero yo veo un problema más complejo. Yo veo varios actores aquí, que es la empresa, el trabajador, el sindicato y el Estado como un elemento regulador o una OIT, digamos, que de alguna forma visualiza los temas que la complejidad que está sucediendo allí. Y en estos actores se mueve el tema de el mercado, los tratados del mercado. Entonces yo creo que hay como un tema ahí complejo en el sentido de que hay las fuerzas sociales, fuerzas económicas que están en constante dinámica de cuál es la mejor. Se hace un tratado internacional o un TLC con un gobierno o gobiernos donde uno es más dominante que el otro, en donde sí es cierto que los aranceles o se reducen, no es mínimo, pero alguien gana, ese es el negocio. Entonces, en ese marco, el que está en menos posición dominante pierde. Y entonces yo entiendo que ese modelo hay que evaluar y crear un modelo donde hay una armonización entre todos los actores. Así lo entiendo. Y eso implica, cuando esto no está armonizado, implica que haya problemas sociales, ¿sí? Haya huelgas, haya descontento entre la gente. Cuando uno podía entender que el trabajador es que enriquece al empresario. El trabajador es el que mueve la economía. Entonces no hay un equilibrio. Y debido a ese equilibrio se presentan todos estos problemas. Ya el problema aquí no es social, sino entender cómo es la dinámica de la sociedad desde el punto de vista comercial. Pienso que el trabajador es la persona clave para el crecimiento de la economía y del empresario. Cuando hay un TLC y el que domina, por ejemplo, aquí lo podemos ver. Ustedes en pandemia se dieron cuenta, nos dimos cuenta que al principio íbamos al supermercado y encontrábamos, hay cositas, ¿no? Cuando se iba a acabar la pandemia, bueno, ya íbamos al supermercado y no encontramos nada. ¿Qué significaba eso? Que todo lo traemos de fuera. Entonces, en nuestros recursos, nuestras empresas, no surge justamente por ello. Aquí hacer innovación, hacer startup, es muy difícil. Eh, Varios ejemplos. En España, algún ingeniero hizo un LED, un bombillo, donde prácticamente duraba mucho tiempo. Inmediatamente las empresas multinacionales que fabrican luminarias, bombillos, lo quebraron, los bancos, no lo dejaron progresar. Entonces hay un problema ahí de derechos humanos, también de crecimiento. El problema, pues todos se enlazan, lo que hemos hablado estos días. Entonces yo pienso que hay que pensar un poquito más allá sobre formular modelos armonizantes entre el empresario, entre los tratados internacionales, que sean más equilibrantes, que muevan esto, ¿no? Siempre habrá alguien que se lleva la mayor tajada y el que se lleva la menor, va a haber un problema ahí social. Entonces esto implica ya un tema social. Eso es como una reflexión. No sé ustedes qué opinan. Ok, muchas gracias.
No, muchas gracias por la reflexión y coincido con usted de que es un tema mucho más complejo que legal. Tiene muchos aristas y tiene muchas líneas de entrada para abordar un tema que tiene que ver con la sociedad en su conjunto, ¿no? Y a partir de eso, que cada uno de los estados tome las decisiones que tiendan, bueno, desde nuestra perspectiva, o la perspectiva de la OIT, que tiendan efectivamente a reposicionar los valores fundacionales de la organización que están sobre la promoción de la justicia social. Entonces, el tema es cómo hacerlo y cómo llevarlo. Ahora bien, uno no puede ignorar que la interconexión del mundo o la interdependencia del mundo en diferentes secciones es una realidad que hay que aprender a no solamente administrar, sino que a utilizar de la mejor manera para mejorar ese tema de justicia social. Hay países que han decidido una situación, unas vías diferentes y, por supuesto, uno puede hacer un debate mucho más amplio en ese sitio sobre los efectos que se tienen, pero fundamentalmente coincido con la complejidad ah, de cómo vamos a abordar este tema y que es mucho más allá que lo meramente legal o normativo.
Sí, claro. Sí, no, no, ya lo último, si uno mira el salario mínimo legal, el más grande está en Costa Rica, ¿no? $720. Claro, en Venezuela son $4. En Colombia estamos en $349, $349. Claro, hay una diferencia, unas barreras, una brecha salarial grandísima. Entonces eso va, pues esto me llama la atención, por ejemplo, yo pensaría que ustedes conocen la pirámide de Maslow y yo pienso que es muy bien interesante entenderla y en qué plano estamos en la pirámide.
Muchas
Ok,
gracias por su
muchas gracias.
intervención. Con esto damos por terminado este panel. Vamos a tener 10 minutos para tomar café en la parte de atrás y vamos a seguir con el siguiente panel que va a ser sobre transición verde. Muchas gracias a los panelistas. Thank you very much, Christina, for joining us from Belgium. Y esperamos que les haya gustado.
Muchas gracias.
Llegó la siguiente.
No, entonces,
Entonces, estoy en contacto con ustedes, ya que este es el tema de mi doctorado.
De los diferentes temas que se ha venido y todo. Seguramente conoce esta publicación la del 2023, de tener estos tomos y que ahora son algo que creo que se habla mucho. Interesante. Eso, bueno, que podamos apoyar.
Sí, sí, buenísimo, te lo puedo pasar. Sí, ellos me si quieres te lo mando.
Sí.
Ahora sí que está silenciado.
Hi, Josephine. We will start in about 10 minutes, but we would like to check the sound if you are there and you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfect. Thank you. We will
Just check
start
the
at,
video. Yeah, I'll check the video as well. Wait, you see me also?
yes,
Yeah.
we can see you.
Okay.
Happy to see you
Okay, great.
again.
See you in 10 minutes or so.
Perfect. Thank you.
Y este es para la transmisión, no, solo hay dos, entonces por eso toca pasar, sí, los dos, eso sí no es la transmisión.
Esta pregunta, ¿ustedes van a ayudar con los tiempos o miran el celular? Sí, mejor estoy revisando porque pues de pronto van a seguirlo, porque igual estaba hasta las 12:30, ¿no? Sí. ¿Quieres que yo te haga alguna señal en algún momento? Sí, yo creo que cuando quedan como unos 10, 15 minutos para poder abrir la ronda de preguntas. Cuando quedan 10. ¿Listo? ¿Perfecto? Sí.
¿Todo bien? Sí, sí, conozco al fotógrafo, la Valeria. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo te ha ido, Felipe?
Estoy con
Escribí esta mañana. ¿Eh?
por correo.
Sí, sí. No, después de 1000 años que preguntaste, por favor, respóndame. Yo respondí 1000 años.
Ay, bueno, pero pues mejor verdad que no tuve la oportunidad de verlo.
Ah, bueno, no, porque ahí nos tenías a mí como en una pregunta del Global Gateway, que yo no conozco mucho de eso.
Ok.
Entonces yo estoy como en la primera pregunta que...
Igual si quieres podemos tener como reframing y no solamente hablar desde el Global Gateway Strategy, sino como en general de la como transferencia de tecnología y especialmente por ejemplo en la industria de comida, que yo sé que tú ahorita estás como en todo un trabajo gigante de como promoción de políticas sostenibles de comida. ¿Cómo podría de pronto eso influir en esa relación comercial que tenemos?
Y la primera pregunta también, ¿me muestras la primera que tú tienes? Yo estaba también en la primera.
La primera es, what role can Latin American and Caribbean states play?
Eso sí, creo que ahí estaba yo también, pero bueno,
Sí, sí.
me voy a ir. Bueno, no sé
No, sí, si estás justo acá, solo que no.
Listo, todo bien. Pero voy a hacer una presentación rápida, tú presentas mis panelistas, todo yo.
Bueno, bienvenidos todos de nuevo. Vamos a arrancar con nuestro segundo panel del día, de la mañana. Este panel ahora versa sobre esta interacción con el derecho del medio ambiente, un panel que, al igual que el anterior, sin duda nos va a dejar unas reflexiones muy interesantes. Entonces, les cedo la palabra a Valeria Jurado. Josephine, welcome all the way from Brussels, I imagine. Very pleased to have you with us. Valerie, te doy la palabra y muchas gracias a todos de nuevo.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me all right? Hello. Hi, everyone. How are you today? It's great to be here. A pleasure to be in Universidad de los Andes, and especially in the framework of the European Union and Latin American and Caribbean states community, because there's so much relevant things to say about climate change today. And my name is Valeria Jurado. As Simone was saying, I'm a lawyer, and I have a very keen interest in international economic law as well as environmental law. And it is an honor to be here hosting this panel on climate change and green transitions. So we're joined by a distinguished set of panelists, and they will be guiding us through a conversation on not only environmental concerns, but how climate change is just as much a social, an economic, and a legal challenge. A legal challenge that demands coordinated, inclusive, and forward-thinking actions in a global context. So our discussion today will focus on a series of different topics around climate change. For example, we will talk about sustainable development, about climate justice, about global value chains and production processes. And we will also be talking about all of this in a broader framework of sustainable development. So now I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to introduce all of our wonderful panelists. First, we have Josephine Norris, who's joining us online. Josephine is a member of the European Commission Legal Service, where she specializes in international trade, WTO law, and investment arbitration. In addition to her work at the Commission, she is also a professor of international trade and the law of international organizations, as well as a barrister in England, Wales, and Ireland. Her extensive experience spans from trade-related aspects of energy, global governance, sustainability, and global value chains. We are also joined here by Nicolás Torres Álvarez, who is Deputy Director at the ANDI, la Asociación Nacional de Empresarios de Colombia. And he has extensive experience with government relations and sustainable legal management, as well as a WTO law. And he brings a very vital industry perspective to this discussion today on how local companies and organizations interact with recent green policies from the European Union. And we're also joined today by two very esteemed household guests, professors here at the Universidad de los Andes. First, we have Felipe Goa. He is a doctor in international development, food and agriculture in Colombia from the University of Oxford. He is also a professor at the School of Government here at the Universidad de los Andes and is also a research director at Table. And it's a global platform working on enhancing and pursuing sustainable local food practices and food systems. So his research focuses also on climate change, local development, and the politics of food provisioning in Colombia. And last but not least, Juan Manuel Amaya. He is a doctor in law from Leiden University and professor at the School of Law at Universidad de los Andes. He is an expert in international law, economic international law, WTO law, as well as global governance and political science. His research includes analysis on free trade agreements involving Colombia, as well as research on broader international challenges such as migration and global value chains with social traceability, which is very important to this discussion as well. And together with our four panelists, who, as you can note, they have very extensive experience that will be super valuable for today's conversation. And they will be exploring the challenges posed by current European Union regulation and how the green policies and the Green Deal, for example, require cooperation from both CELAC and European Union states to shape inclusive and effective ecological transitions. So just to give it a little bit of context or clarify the format of the panel, each question will be delivered to two panelists who will each have approximately 6 to 7 minutes to answer each question and share their perspectives with the audience. So without further ado, let's begin with our discussion on climate change. And the first question is going to be directed to, Felipe and Juan Manuel. And we're going to start in a foundational issue in climate governance, which is the role of the Global South in shaping effective international adaptation strategies, and particularly how countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean who face severe impacts from climate change, and we're seeing so many adverse effects locally, can take leadership and take their voices to broader international contexts. So this brings us to our first question, and that is, what role can Latin American and Caribbean states play in shaping effective climate change adaptation strategies? And how can those efforts be integrated into international climate agendas, such as the European Green Deal? And as a follow-up question, how can the European Union support Latin American countries in achieving their climate-related goals? So first, Felipe, if you can go ahead.
Okay.
Provide your perspective.
I have to hold both? Okay, it's new for me. Thank you so much for the invitation to our hosts, and welcome everyone to Universidad de los Andes. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel sharing with all of you. So perhaps I'd like to start off by saying two things that I consider essential in the discussion of climate change. First is we cannot separate climate change from biodiversity when we talk about Latin America. First thing first, right? I mean, we of course, we're interested about climate change, about greenhouse gas emissions, but we cannot ignore the fact that Latin America is the top one biodiversity region in the world, right? Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and the other countries of the Amazon basin, right? So we have to contextualize a little bit the starting point of a region. So that's the first thing I'd like to mention about your question, Valerie. Second one is I really celebrate the European Green Deal, right? The most ambitious climate policy that the European Union has ever had. And I think, and I'd like to maybe later on hear the thoughts from Josephine, because it acknowledges a little bit of blame on the European Union, right? Through the Green Deal, the European Union is recognizing that the European market was having imported deforestation. That's how they are calling it, right? So that the demand for certain products in the European Union was causing deforestation in other parts of the world. So that's the second starting point of my response. Now, I work in food. Right, I not only because I eat and I love different types of food, but because I work on food systems, and food systems is all the activities, dynamics, processes, and actors that are involved from the seed or from the farm to the plate and beyond, if we include nutrition. And now, what is important in this discussion when we talk about the relationship between two regions of the world that have a very strong market? And I'll give you one example that we can't avoid now. Everyone now loves avocados, right? And there's like a huge fuss about avocados. It became trendy, it became nice, it became like avocado smoothie, which I still don't get. But everyone loves avocado, right? And there's a huge demand for avocados lately, the past 5 to 10 years in the European Union, right? In 2021, Colombia became the top first exporter of avocado has to the European Union, even more so than Mexico, that is the top exporter of the world, right? And huge opportunity, that's fantastic, right? For Colombia, for our country, this is great. I mean, we have a strong market to which we are now supplying large quantities of avocado. But we have to look into the details of the implications of this demand from the European Union. So because there is a strong market now, there's huge expansion of avocado production, right? Avocado crop, including areas where nature and ecosystems are very fragile. And that's the case for the central Cordillera Central, right? The central mountain range in Colombia. I had the opportunity to go there 3 weeks back with my students for fieldwork. This is a municipality called Cajamarca. And there are high mountain ecosystems, right? So like Andean forest and páramos. And there is the national tree of Colombia, right? The palm. La palma de cera, right? Palm trees, which is our national tree. And because this expansion of avocado crops in this region is having significant ecosystem impacts in this region. There's nothing wrong about avocados. There's nothing wrong about international trade. There's nothing wrong about demanding avocados. But what we have to think in this case is what are the implications of this market expansion? And that's when the European Green Deal comes into play, because they are now requesting no deforestation certificates and traceability, which is in theory, it is great. However, it is also imposing a significant barrier to smallholders. And this is the last part of my response, so that we can have more conversation and presentation. But these deforestation certificates that the European Green Deal is asking to smallholders, to everyone exporting to the European market, is posing significant challenges, in principle, technological challenges as well, because let's change crop from avocado to coffee, our top crop, right? And the smallholders don't have necessarily enough technology to provide traceability certificates for the European Union. How do we go about that? How do smallholders with little access to technology provide traceability certificates and no deforestation certificates to a huge market, right? And that's when the associations and federations, the Coffee Federation comes into play because they have to play as a collective actor and not as individual producers. So those are just like two different, the case of the avocado, the case of coffee, and the context for the relationship, the international trade between the two regions.
Well, thank you, Felipe, for that very interesting and fresh perspective on the European Green Deal's impact on local economies such as Colombia. We have definitely seen the impact of the EU-DR, not only in the way in which it has motivated a lot of small companies to start implementing sustainable practices, but in the way that it has, in some way or another, forced us to recognize that there are definitely extraterritorial impacts of policies that come from another jurisdiction or another country, such as it would be in the cases for the European Union states. And with that, well, view on regional dynamics on commodities such as coffee, which is definitely in the EU-DR list of commodities, we can now open the floor for Juan Manuel to bring us his perspective on this question as well.
Thanks very much. So yes, I've been struck by how the European Union Green Deal, first of all, needs to be defended somehow. You need to put that first. Second, as how it's framed as an international initiative, and it's not. It's a European initiative. I was struck yesterday also by how some of our European guests talked about, well, you in Latin America, you're still very much attached to sovereignty. We're above that, which is very striking, because this is a bit how a European law was taught in the 1990s when I was a student in Leiden, and it's just it's simplifying things too much, I think. First of all, the European Union acts as a sovereign. And second of all, sovereignty is not necessarily bad. It's how you use it that matters. So it's a bit of a awkward framing of the situation. Having said that, I often encounter, when I talk about these topics with my colleagues here, I often encounter a gut reaction, when we discuss the extraterritorial effect of European Union legislation, because the European Union Green Deal in various ways impacts us, governs us. And so the gut reaction is, well, that's neo-colonial. And I love to troll my interlocutors by saying, I know, isn't it great? It's a neo-colonialism that we like, because it is really very, very mistaken to see in these extraterritorial governance by the EU the neo-colonialism. The neo-colonialism lies in our structural dependency on European markets, in our structural dependency on European investment, in our structural dependency on access to European technology. That is where the neo-colonialism lies, not in well-intended leadership, as I see the Green Deal. It is actually, and in this moment that the European Union is kind of like having second thoughts, maybe we should militarize instead of being so green, which I think is a mistake, although I understand it. And in this moment in which the United States has decided not to be a leader in any way, I think we need it. We need it, and we need to integrate it, which is what the meeting in Santa Marta is about. And so, to go back, it's all very nice, the Green Deal, but a key element of the Green Deal and a key element of what the European Union requires from exporters of products is that, we don't harm our environment, that we don't deforest, that we respect human rights, that we respect the environment in our production, in our supply chains. And a key element there is always, risk analysis and risk management. And a key element of risk analysis and risk management is stakeholder engagement. Now, I think stakeholder engagement is great. So, it's a bit late, but good, congratulations with your Green Deal. Where was the stakeholder engagement? We're stakeholders too. And so, it's not too late to learn your own lessons, European Union, and we will happily help you with that if you accept us as stakeholders. And what does that mean? What it means is that if you want to help us, and we definitely feel that we don't want to do this alone. I mean, we shouldn't be, we shouldn't embrace false pride and dignity and stuff. Just like I scold the European Union, I also want to scold my compatriots. Excessive pride is a vice, not a virtue. So yes, we definitely feel that we can use some help. We can use some help, but first see what we have already been doing. The way that Latin American countries and Caribbean countries have been identifying specific ecosystems, which is a very different approach. This is not really the central part of the European approach is to focus on specific ecosystems. Really changes the perspective. It's not easy either. Help us with that, connect with that. And there are some initiatives that can be upscaled. And then second, Philippe already mentioned traceability. I mean, traceability, there's two types of traceability in the context of deforestation. Traceability is basically saying, take a picture of the place where the avocado was grown and compare that to a picture starting in 2024, I think it was. And if there was a tree that is not there any longer, you have deforested, and so that's bad. Okay, you have to start somewhere, and this is a type of traceability that is a start, but you have to develop it. The big challenge in environmental governance is how do you connect, general principles with the complexities on the ground. I mean, if we're going to be ecological, you need to be sensitive to specific micro, meso, macro dynamics. And so integrate that into your traceability requirements. The other type of traceability has to do with the stakeholder engagement, with the environmental, labor, governance dimension, the input of local communities. That is also something that needs to be integrated in social auditing mechanisms. That is also something that requires a governance infrastructure, just like, don't even get me started about sanitary requirements. That requires a governance infrastructure. It requires that you help, because it's not just the smallholders that have to deal with that. It is actually the state and the gremios or the economic groups of agricultural and industrial producers. They can also assist in building the infrastructure required for traceability. And so I think we should do that together. We should consider traceability as not just something that happens here and not there, but as something that needs to be constructed as an infrastructure both here and there. And so want to meet up, want to join up?
Oh, thank you, Juan Manuel. Can you hear me with this microphone as well? Perfect. So thank you, Juan Manuel, for also building up on how these initiatives require global cooperation, and global cooperation that also starts from a standpoint of a comprehensive responsibility, acknowledging what each state can offer and what each state has already done, in the pursuit of environmental transitions towards more sustainable practices. So let's now turn to a critical structural issue of climate regulation. As climate policies we see every day become more and more ambitious, both in Colombia, which we've seen recently a lot of local environmental laws. We've also seen that coming from the European Green Deal. And we need to understand the impact on global production and trade systems, which is something that is increasingly evident as what we've seen with both Felipe's response and Juan Manuel's response. And as such, the regulation of global value chains and production processes becomes more and more important. And it is a central issue in aligning environmental goals that come from a specific jurisdiction with actual realities from other jurisdictions and other economic realities. So I'd like to ask Josephine and Nicolas, to discuss how should international legal frameworks evolve to better regulate global value chains in a way that promotes environmental sustainability and climate resilience, while ensuring that obligations for both CELAC and EU states are fair. So, Josephine, we'll begin with your considerations on this question. If you can go ahead and take the floor.
Good morning. I think it's morning for you, evening for me. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you on this very interesting discussion. So I will also start my few thoughts with a couple of basic premises, which I think it's useful to recall. And the first is that trade in goods has changed significantly over the past 20 years. So we do now talk about global value chains because production processes have been broken down. And although we're living in an era where there is perhaps a push politically to reverse some of those trends, that cannot be fully reversed. So I would suggest that global value chains and this fragmentation in production processes is a trend that is here for the future. So it remains very relevant as we look forward to how regulation should continue to evolve. And the second premise I wanted to set out is that everybody cares actually about environmental sustainability and climate change. That's not just a concern of the European Union or just a concern of CELAC member states. And I think that that was really, really clear from the submissions of many, many states to the International Court of Justice in the framework of the advisory opinion on the obligations of states in relation to climate change. There was a huge unity that this is a very real issue of concern. So then you're left with this situation where clearly trade and environmental and climate issues have to be reconciled. That's also not a new realization. And the way that you do it, however, is something which needs to take into account this economic reality of the way that production works in a globalized economy. So in your question, you referred to international legal frameworks. And of course, there are the classic tools that exist. In the trade sphere, we have the WTO agreements, the rules-based system, and the question is, can the way that that's interpreted accommodate the practical realities of goods moving now across many borders? I think we have seen recent cases which suggest that those concerns can be looked at. There were the two palm oil disputes, DS 600, DS 593. Both of those resulted in an evaluation actually of EU legislation, which was aiming to address sustainability concerns. And of course, the panel found that the way that the European Union was applying the rules wasn't fully consistent with the WTO agreement. So I think that that case, really, those disputes would show you that the WTO system does have some margin to look at these balancing between green and free trade. On the other hand, you have other international frameworks. You have the classic bilateral trade agreements, but of course they have certain limitations when it comes to managing a complex production process, because a bilateral agreement might not fully capture an entire production chain. And so what you're then left with at the international level, and I think that it is this gap which partly explains why the EU adopted its own measures in the Green Deal, is soft law. So global governance structures which push really the responsibility to individual corporations to voluntarily adopt different standards. And that is where you see the role of due diligence guidance, for example, from the OECD. Some of it's sectoral, some of it's horizontal. And what we see there, though, is an opt-in. And the reality was, at least in the European Union, when they analyzed it, that the degree of opt-in was, shall we say, suboptimal. There was many companies who simply weren't addressing those norms. So to answer your question, how should international legal frameworks evolve? Well, I think you have to continue to use the existing structures within the World Trade Organization agreements and push for interpretations which really allow for measures to be tested. That's precisely the role of a dispute settlement system. But I think that you also have to look at ways to ensure that there is buy-in to addressing sustainability along a production process. And it's as much a problem within the European Union as well. And I think that this is something that should be stressed. The EU's rules, which you've been talking about, the two previous panel members referred to the EUDR, they apply equally within the European Union. Now, not all of the goods are produced to the same extent in the European Union, but where the European Union produces those goods, they must also meet the same obligations. So I think that that is an important consideration. Of course, fairness and going forwards, one of the key issues, and again, the previous panelists have touched on this, is regulatory burden, because it is clear that when you have measures that require traceability along production chains, then the extent that that imposes a burden isn't neatly divided equally along the chain. It depends very much on the nature of the participant in the chain, the resources they have at their disposal, what type of production they're involved in, as to how hard it really is to comply with a rule. So I think that in that sense, you have to, looking forward, it will be very important to reflect on how these rules can be simplified. And that is a process which is very much ongoing in the European Union. As I'm sure you're aware, there are 6 simplification packages under discussion. And there are new proposals as recently as sort of a week ago on EUDR. So I think that what we see is a recognition that there has to be a simplification. And maybe that is one of the key areas for future international frameworks, is to look at how to make these rules, which pursue legitimate and actually widely supported objectives, manageable in practice. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Josephine, for clarifying a lot of the complex issues of global value chains and production processes that occur not only in the European Union, but also that have, well, links through different countries that go through the production process. And well, there is something that is very valuable in the way that the European Union not only has forwarded sort of the world towards looking at green policies in an integrated way, but that there is adaptation in a sense to needs that have been placed by countries. For example, initiatives like the Andes Initiative to support their local producers to ensure that they can adapt to Green Deal policies such as the EUDR, but also so that they can have conversations with the European Union that can be shown as having effects on these simplification packages. And so that, following that, Nicolas, I'd like to let you go ahead and take the floor and provide your insight on this issue.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the hosts for inviting me to this, I consider, very important event. First of all, let me say that my views do not necessarily represent Andy's or its members' views, but I do work for Andy and have an experience with specifically the food industry sector, which is very much related to environment, since it is part of a value chain that is strongly tied to the environment. And also, let me say that I am aware that global value chains are very important in this analysis because companies that are part of those chains are subject to several jurisdictions and several legal systems, as well as to the international legal framework. So this is something that is in some way complex to manage because the requirements that companies have to comply with can be numerous, and sometimes some of them can be opposite. This is a challenge, and I think that international legal frameworks are very useful in order to try to have concepts that are uniform and that and interpretations that will allow to apply both national and international law in a way that is protective of the environment. So I think that one benefit of having international legal frameworks is that companies as stakeholders that need to apply these legal frameworks will have more certainty on what they should do. However, I think that I have participated in the discussions of some of the international environmental agreements, as well as in discussions within the Trade and Environment Committee. And I think that we still need to have more policy coherence in the international legal framework. Because sometimes regulators that negotiate these international agreements or that issue this domestic regulation regarding the environment are focused mainly in protecting the environment. But there is a context for the protection of the environment. There are people and there are companies that have to participate in this in all what the legal framework establishes. So there needs to be more participation in the discussion of this legal framework, and there needs to be also coherence with other legal frameworks. For example, the legal frameworks regarding trade and international trade, domestic and international trade, and also investment. I think that if there is more coherence, there will be more benefit to the environment than if all these kind of regulations are competing against each other. Then I think that this is something that is taken into account in many international legal frameworks regarding the environment discussions, which is capacity building. But sometimes this capacity building needs to be taken into account in the context of the stakeholders. As previous speakers mentioned, sometimes the regulators or the negotiators of international agreements think that they only need to establish financial instruments in order to provide this capacity building. But sometimes not only financial instruments are needed. Sometimes there is a need of a more specific technical assistance and more transfer of knowledge and transfer of technology in order to create more capacities in the territories in which the agreements are applied. Also, I think that this is also discussed in many negotiations, but I would like to stress that transition is very important for countries with less capacities to implement the obligations in the agreement. So this is something I would like to stress. Also, the differences in the legal systems. Sometimes when the negotiators or the main negotiators, the lead negotiators or the negotiators of leading countries in international agreements belong to a certain legal system, they might think that the way in which the agreement is applied will be consistent with their legal system. And sometimes this is not the case. Sometimes institutions and the legal structure of countries changes and makes it more difficult to implement obligations. So I think that agreements need to take into account these differences in legal systems and try to establish provisions that can be applied in these different legal systems.
Thank you, Nicolas. And you talk about something that is very interesting, which is sort of evident when you start to analyze how countries have tackled environmental policies, and it is that there isn't a lot of cohesion. And it is important that, in your words, we stop competing in legal systems internally and start to adapt to a more global context, because climate change does require global action. So let's now move to a deeply important dimension of our conversation on global value chains, and such as the extraterritorial effects, which is something that we've briefly discussed throughout the interventions up until now. But we're going to understand a little bit more about how global value chains have extraterritorial effects, the impact it may have on climate justice. And with that, Nicolas and Josephine, I'd like to continue on this train of thought on global value chains and answer, to what extent does the European Union's approach to regulating global value chains challenge regulatory sovereignty of partner countries? And what should be taken into consideration to protect diverse climate interests and economic interests? And to answer this question, I would also like you to keep in mind how industries can navigate EU sustainability standards across these value chains. So, Nicolas, would you like to begin on this question?
Thank you. Let me start by saying how important is the EU for Colombia regarding trade. EU is Colombia's third trading partner. It is the second destination for its exports and the third origin for its imports coming from the European Union. And even though we have a trade imbalance, a negative trade imbalance with the European Union, the characteristic I would like to highlight from EU-Colombia trade is that in the past few years, agri-food, well, first, non-mining exports have been growing a lot. And now we have more non-mining exports than mining exports. So we are becoming a provider of the European Union in products that have some added value. And within the non-mining exports, the agri-food exports have been growing quickly. They have, for example, grown in the past year by 79%, which is a very high figure. So we have become a more important supplier of the European Union in this sector. Of course, as providers of the European Union, we're participants of value chains that are able to produce what is demanded in the European Union. Whenever we are exporting, especially agri-food sector products, companies and exporters need to take into account both the bilateral regulatory framework regarding environment, which is in force between Colombia and the European Union, and also the unilateral measures taken by the European Union. Regarding the bilateral rules that govern trade between EU and Colombia, of course, all of you know that we have a bilateral trade agreement, which has a trade and sustainable development chapter. And this trade and sustainable chapter has some characteristics. It mentions the adherence to several multilateral environmental agreements, which were negotiated in the discussions of this agreement. It also prohibits lowering protections to encourage trade and investment. And it has a non-regression clause, which prevents parties from reducing standards for competitive gain. So what I'm trying to say is that with the agreement and with the participation of both parties, the EU and Colombia, we have accepted a legal framework, an international legal framework that is applicable in both countries. By accepting that legal framework means that, at least from a part of Colombia, that it has recognized that this legal framework has a bearing in complying with its goals regarding the environment, but also its goals regarding trade, investment, and in general, the economy. This chapter, I think, has a very important feature, which is that it is not subject to the dispute settlement chapter of the agreement, so there will be no trade disputes, so trade will not be affected by any discussion regarding the compliance of this chapter. But instead, it has mechanisms for dialogue between countries. So I think Josephine mentioned about soft law. This is an agreement which is agreed hard law, but the parties have agreed to, rather than having a lot of binding obligations, specific obligations regarding the environment, having mechanisms for dialogue. And according to the agreement, parties meet in an annual basis. They have met almost every year since the agreement came into force. And in many of those meetings, the experts on environment have met and have discussed with respect both to policy, domestic policy, and policy that has to do with the international legal framework. And in those discussions, they have, of course, touched upon the European Green Deal. But when speaking about the Green Deal, they have discussed about the challenges in order to implement several requirements in accordance with that Green Deal. Regarding the unilateral measures, which I also mentioned, well, there are many now in place. I think this is a newer approach in which the European Union has tried to establish within its legal framework several provisions that seek to achieve some environmental goals of the European Union by trying to have an impact in international economic operations. So I think that this is something that needs to be highlighted because whereas the European Union is trying to achieve its own goals, its measures have an impact in stakeholders outside of the European Union. And this is something very important because these stakeholders do not have the chance to participate in the discussions on how these provisions are drafted. And I believe that in many cases, at least in general, the goals are shared. Many other countries, and I think Colombia is one of those countries, shares many of the general environmental goals of the European Union, because as mankind, we know that we have been having an impact on the planet, and that we need to do something in order to prevent having more impact and to try to reduce this impact by our actions. So I think in general, we share many of the goals of the European Union, but the question is, how is the European Union trying to achieve these goals? And this is something that, as I said, is not being discussed with stakeholders. And let me go back to the EUDR as an example. EUDR is a legal instrument based on due diligence, which means that risk assessment and management is very important. And as Josephine said, it applies mainly to European operators, which are the importers, but also the producers within the European Union of certain products, which happen to be agricultural products, and which happen to cover at least three products that are very important for the Colombian agri-food global value chain, which are coffee, palm oil, and cocoa, and for which Colombia is a very important supplier to the European Union. Remember that I, at the outset, indicated that the agri-food business has between Colombia and the EU has been growing a lot. So the impact of this regulation in an economy like Colombia is quite big. As I was saying, due diligence is central to the EUDR. But this is a concept that was not very well known for farmers and for the industry. Probably in academic meetings like this one, there were people that knew more about due diligence at the outset of the discussions of the EUDR than people from than farmers and people from the industry. So the first thing is to try to understand what due diligence means.
Sorry, if you could maybe take 30 seconds.
Yes,
to conclude.
Sure. What it requires and what actions need to be taken. And I think in this last 30 seconds, I think that, as was mentioned, Andy, as part of other associations, has been very active in trying to let farmers and the industry know what is the scope and what farmers and industry have to do, and exactly how they have to do it, because this is something that is not very clear if you only read the text of the UDR. And I think here you can see an example of how a regulator like the EU has been trying also to help all the stakeholders in trying to understand and implement these kind of instruments.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that perspective. And it's very important to understand that regulations on global value chains will have the main impact on local producers that are not the big corporations that have very maybe prominent lawyers helping them navigate these types of policies when they are exporting, but the local producers that maybe don't have such a close relationship to the European Union Green Deal regulation, and they won't necessarily know how to navigate that regulation or start implementing the right strategies to complete due diligence processes and start traceability on their lands. Some may not even have access to traceability certificates that they can provide. So this is something that is definitely a process that local governments and, well, local associations such as the Andy have a key role in playing, which is helping local producers navigate international regulations. So Josephine, if you could go ahead and please provide your insights on these matters.
Thanks very much. And maybe at the beginning, I should just give a little disclaimer, which is although I am a member of the European Commission Legal Service, I'm not speaking on behalf of the official position of the European Union in this particular setting. So I will try and unpack a little bit of what's just been said. And I think it was really helpful to explain that we have both bilateral agreements, indeed the trade agreements, and we also have what some people call unilateral, others call autonomous EU measures, setting market access conditions. So I think, and I've written a book on this topic, so I have really looked into all of the drivers for the EU's regulation, because I think it's interesting to understand that what the EU was doing was precisely supplementing its toolkit. It had the bilateral agreements, it had its TSD chapters, some limitations of the trade and sustainable development chapters were highlighted when it proved very difficult to enforce the obligations thereunder. And so what we have in these unilateral measures, which came under the auspices of the Green Deal, is really an effort to further ensure that these environmental objectives are actually meaningful because of the way that trade works and because of the globalized nature of value chains. So where does that lead us in terms of this question around regulatory sovereignty? Well, I think first let's clear up a big myth that's out there. Yes, these rules do have extraterritorial effects, and I don't think that the European Union would ever suggest otherwise. That is what they're designed to do. They are designed precisely to regulate along a global value chain. So sometimes people suggest that the EU is a denialist on that front. I really don't think that is the case. They do have extraterritorial effects, and they do so by design. Now, that is, of course, very different to being the equivalent of an exercise of extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is another debate. But of course, they've also elicited a lot of criticism. I think we've heard some of that already from your panel in terms of the impacts that they have on different stakeholders. And I think that it's important to stress how these rules actually work. And we come back there to this quality of setting a market access condition. So what does it actually mean? It means that the rules only apply to the extent that you want to put your product on the EU market. Now, the EU is an important destination market. I think that was very helpfully given concrete meaning in the terms of Colombia with the explanation that it's the third most important trading partner. So yes, the EU is an important destination market, but it is not, unless it is only if you're trying to place your product on the EU market or export from the EU market that these rules apply. I think the second point to stress is that there are indeed many now unilateral measures. We've talked a lot about the EUDR, but there are others, both sectoral, and there are others tackling issues such as forced labor and so on. And they do have this due diligence approach. And what does that mean? It means that the obligation is to ensure that a product is, say, deforestation free, but then the onus is on the operator to show that this is the case. So does this interfere with regulatory sovereignty? Well, the strict legal answer would be no, because the EU is not saying to operators in third countries, you must follow specific norms in order to import or export your product anywhere. What it's saying is, once you want to place them on my market, irrespective of where you've made them, then our consumers have a particular concern and want to be sure that what they're purchasing complies with certain standards. But I also wanted to address very briefly, and I'm conscious of the time, this question on navigating the rules. And there I think that a little bit ironically, perhaps, it's taking 6 simplification packages to try and make them a little bit clearer. And that is because it is undeniable that these multiple regimes, and as I said, there are others, there's corporate sustainability due diligence, there's EUDR, there's the CBAM, there's a whole raft of global value chain regulations actually coming from the EU, and they are difficult to navigate. And that is a point which has been raised by many stakeholders, both EU operators, non-EU based operators, I think there is actually a lot of common accord that the rules are pretty complicated to follow. So the question then practically, how can you navigate this if you are an operator? And I think that there you have to look to the efforts that are now being made by the Commission to publish more operational guidance. So if you take the EUDR as an example, there have been several iterations now of the frequently asked questions that builds on the feedback that comes from stakeholders really looking at how they're going to adjust their systems to apply the rules. I think, on the other hand, the fact that we are in this process of simplification with so many packages under discussion means that there is a degree of regulatory uncertainty, which does just make it difficult right now for operators to know both when the rules will come into application and what exactly they would need to do. But I think finally, and here I really do have to push back a little bit, I've heard several times people say that there was no stakeholder engagement. It is the case that a number of third countries have described it as suboptimal, but to say that there was none is really an exaggeration. Firstly, there were impact assessments before these rules were adopted, and there were open public consultations. And anyone can participate in an open public consultation, and the statistics show that many third countries, industry associations, and so on did. And secondly, there has been a huge amount of multilateral and bilateral outreach on these instruments. I think that the EUDR is one of the most discussed instruments. It's raised in multiple fora. It's been discussed in the context of the COP. It's been discussed many, many times in the WTO, and the rules are not yet in application. And there is now an ongoing simplification process. So I think it's this idea that there has been no stakeholder engagement, really there I have to push back. Of course, what is correct is that it has impacts on many, many stakeholders precisely because of the nature of the regulation itself. I think that at this point, I hope that that's shed a little bit of a different perspective on some of these issues. But perhaps one closing thing to say, the EU was a first mover on many of this legislation. When you raise the regulatory bar, when you move first, you know, there are going to be questions, there are going to be challenges that emerge, and regulating a global value chain is inherently extremely complex because global value chains are all different, they're all unique, and there are all of these jurisdictional challenges that have already been mentioned, that they cross multiple borders, so any kind of regulation has a cumulative effect. I think that it is clear that this is a very difficult exercise in itself. And for that reason alone, continued engagement is extremely important as the rules are refined going forwards. Thank you.
Josephine, thank you so much for providing your insights from the other perspective, which is the European Union. And what you say is very true. Innovation is complicated, especially in innovation with respect to environmental concerns, which is sort of new territory. And in that sense, I would like to go ahead and move forward to shift our focus a little bit to not only the regulatory structures around climate change, but the social dimension of climate concerns. Because we have seen that climate change does not affect every country, every state equally. Some Caribbean countries have definitely seen a bigger impact than other countries that maybe even Colombia has seen. So ecological transitions, such as what we are living right now, have the risk of deepening social inequalities that are not only based on economic differences between one country or the other, but also in the different impacts that countries have been living due to climate effects. So now what we have to understand, or what we are going to start discussing, is how human rights can play an important role in ensuring that climate policies not only protect vulnerable populations, but also uphold fundamental rights when addressing these types of climate concerns. So Juan Manuel and Josephine, you're going to be addressing this question. So how can international human rights law serve as a foundation for climate justice in Latin America and Caribbean states, ensuring that ecological transitions do not deepen social inequalities or violate fundamental rights? And to start us off, Juan Manuel, if you can go ahead.
Thanks. Okay, I think my my most important point here is to observe that human rights, when it comes to justice in general and environmental justice more specifically, human rights are only part of the obligation. We tend to, and I see this with my students all the time, equate human rights with justice. But as has been very, very, very clear, increasingly, human rights offer maybe a part of the road to justice, but they do not address adequately questions of inequality, questions of concentration of wealth. I mean, most of you know Colombia is very, very well equipped with regards to human rights. And we have a very powerful and very active constitutional court, and it has recognized and enlarged the scope of human rights protection, being even I think more progressive in that sense than the Inter-American Human Rights Court, and not even to mention the much more stingy European Court of Human Rights. But and in that sense, there's definitely leadership happening. But as you also know, and as everybody always repeats, Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and so somehow human rights are not designed for that. Some have argued even that human rights have been designed a bit against that, against more visibility on the problem of inequality. Although, inequality per se is not a problem, I think, but can cause many problems. So there I should begin to start framing my answer to this question. And having said that, within the history of human rights discourse, there have been efforts to address questions of social inequality and social equality. Approach that we see in the African continent on the right to development, for example, is a good example, and it's very much an African cause, and with some countries in South Asia also leading this quest for the right to development, and the Office of the High Commissioner has supported this quest for a convention on the right to development. Latin American countries have been more or less lukewarm in support of this, but one of the big places of resistance has been the European Union. So I think if we're going to talk about human rights in the context of climate justice, in particular, we need to address that. We need to address the right to development elephant in the room, and maybe we know we are imperfect. Trust us. In Latin America and the Caribbean with regards to human rights, and respect for human rights and protection of various rights. But climate justice and human rights, and the idea of translating an objective and a value like climate justice into the legal obligations that are inherent and legal responsibilities that are inherent in human rights, I think deserves a more open conversation regarding the collective rights and the right to development in particular, and its implications. Now, instead of the key argument that one hears from the European Union is that the right to development can be used to limit individual civil and political rights. Sure, absolutely. So can civil and political rights themselves can also be used to limit rights. So there's, I think, an important invitation to the EU to be less recalcitrant. Now, I take the point that Josephine made about stakeholders not being that excluded from the development of European Union regulation. And actually, I forgot that part of the problem that happened there is that, you know, Latin American countries, and I'm talking very much about Colombia, were not that much on the ball in spite of people like, you know, our colleague Adriana Vargas, who was in Brussels, kind of like sounding the alarm, like, look, there's this elaborate regulatory regime being set up, you know, we need to actually get more involved. And, you know, we were slow in that. And so there are lessons as well for Latin American, Caribbean countries to get our act together, but also to take the initiative and give more substance to the notion of environmental justice in this context. Because what exactly are we talking about? You know, we're talking about the distribution of costs and benefits regarding the governance of global value chains that we have already discussed. It's Josephine and Nicolas already mentioned, and Felipe as well. We're talking about you know, implementation of procedural rights such as Escazú, such as the Escazú Treaty, that basically you know, you can see it as stakeholder engagement, but with rights, but you know, on, with actual enforceable participatory rights. But we should also address, you know, what is in Colombia also an elephant in the room, which is an enormous concentration of land and the systematic displacement of vulnerable groups and of smallholders and others. And there, you know, though it is always complicated. We have the drug trafficking. We have guerrilla. We have paramilitaries. We have. I mean, it's complicated. We know. It is also even in this government. You know, after having won the elections, with a big emphasis on that topic, it's secondary. It's not really, you know, we don't really know how to take it seriously, or we don't really want to take it seriously. We just kind of like are happily resigning ourselves. Yes, we know there's a lot of inequality in Latin America, and Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world, etc. Let's you know, let's move to more manageable topics than that. It's just we haven't broken it down adequately enough, and there, I think the you know, the EU needs to be like a mentor, perhaps a coach, perhaps. Finally, I completely share the point. My final point. I completely share the emphasis on policy coherence, the compartmentalization, you know, which is part of the problem of part of the things that I think policy, the right to development can actually address. Compartmentalization of various issues related to global value chains, trade, and investment is a problem, and it's part of the learning process that I think Josephine already referred to. But I only want to highlight one thing that Nicolas did not mention, and that I want to underscore, which is the investment dimension and the possibility of investment settlement, investor-state dispute settlement. And the former minister, Luis Carlos Reyes, yesterday discussed the desirability of adding an interpretative note to that ISDS chapter with regards to the EU, as has been done with the US, in order to underscore the thing that is only obvious, that's everywhere obvious, except in that very small compartment that is called investment arbitration. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Manuel. And in the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief and just allow Josephine maybe to expand a little on her thoughts and focus more on how the European Union has leveraged its green policies towards and to address these climate justice concerns. So in the interest of time, Josephine, would you mind answering maybe in around 4 or 5 minutes, if possible?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that all transitions risk inequalities. I think globalization itself is an excellent example where there were negative externalities, which, as I said already, you can have the benefits of globalization, but they're not necessarily distributed equally. And I think it's also now widely accepted and unarguable to contradict that there is a risk that climate transition brings with it also social inequalities. And so climate justice really is a focal point and has been a way to highlight the difficulties confronted by vulnerable states or vulnerable groups. And I think we've already touched upon the role that international courts can play in reinforcing the relevance of international human rights. And I think that maybe that was a huge contribution we've seen over the last months. We've seen a number of rulings from the ICJ, but also from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that really reaffirm this relationship actually between the climate and between international human rights law. And I think that that does give a clearer foundation now to certainly establish greater procedural rights. And I think that those effects will percolate through, and we already see it. Just last week, the European Court of Human Rights gave another ruling in Greenpeace Nordic, and there is a stronger emphasis now on the procedural rights associated with climate policies. And I think that is something that should be welcomed. So to come back to the role of the European Union, well, I would say that in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, they did try to create an interlinkage between climate and human rights. Notably, they had climate transition plans, was one of the obligations that should have been on the very large companies falling within the scope of that directive. And there was also actually a very ambitious and innovative mechanism to increase the possibilities for civil liability. So that was designed precisely to allow stakeholders or victims of human rights abuses or environmental harm to bring claims before European Union courts to make that possible. Sadly, though, this seems to be one of the victims of the simplification process. So I think it's a little bit unfortunate, given that we seem to have two tracks. We have the international court system firmly reinforcing the link between international human rights law and climate change, which should be very welcome. And at the same time, we have the pressure in the name of simplification to remove some of the mechanisms which might have made that actually easier in practical terms for individuals to have. So I hear what you say about the EU being a mentor. I think the rhetoric was definitely there. Let's see how much of the legislation survives. But I would very much hope that moving forwards, this idea that you cannot separate the two remains integrated in the EU policy approach. I think that you do see growing awareness in the legislation, increasing references to indigenous rights and so on. This notion that maybe there is a connection between a trade policy and the needs, the impacts that will have on people, that's definitely there. But as I said, in the legislation itself, it would be important to see what comes out of the future process. And that, I think I did that in 3 minutes, so I will hand the floor back to the chair so that you can move on with your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josephine. And it is really an interesting perspective to see how when international regulation that has international effects sort of starts to have these diverse impacts that maybe were not initially expected come to light. And in the interest of moving forward and closing our panel, let's turn to a forward-looking issue, which is technology and innovation in the context of climate change. And this question goes to Felipe. How can CELAC and EU cooperation promote effective technology transfer and innovation in local industries to support climate adaptation and emissions reduction without reinforcing the economic and technological dependency on the European Union?
Thank you so much for this question. I think that 2025 is an important year because we are marking 10 years since the Paris Agreement, right? And we are also marking 10 years since the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And what's interesting about why this is important, because first we're saying most of the SDGs we're not gonna get to the goals that we set out to achieve in 2030, right? And the second one, it's very likely that we're not going to achieve the goal of 1.5 degrees of global warming since the Paris Agreement, and this is really concerning. I mean, what needs to happen so that we achieve the goals that we were set out to achieve? And this is really concerning. And in this context, and in the context of the conversation we're having, I'd like to say that there are good problems to have, and there are bad problems to have. Right? Bad problems to have, a global leader from a geopolitical and very influential country pulling out of the Paris Agreement, which name I'm not saying. Bad problem to have. Good problem to have. A European Union pushing for no deforestation. And I'm going to give you that one, Josephine. Yes, you were first. And this is a very good problem to have because it's pushing the world to rethink how global value chains are working. And this is where we should put our efforts now. Right? I mean, if COP30 is starting this week in Brazil, right? And the main call from the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been, we need a COP that will deliver and that will not deliver empty political speeches. We need a COP that will deliver action and implementation so that we can reach the goals that we had set for 2030 and for 2050. That's the main hope for this COP that is starting this week in Brazil. And now a second point on the perspectives is there is a lot of emphasis, perhaps a lot, on mitigation, and this is good, right? I mean, 10 years ago, we signed the Paris Agreement, and since then, greenhouse gas emissions have continued to increase, even more so than before, which makes no sense. And yes, we need to focus on mitigation. We need to develop a green transition. We need to transition to renewable energy. This is very important. This is very significant. But for countries or for regions such as Latin America and the Caribbean, the urgent focus should be adaptation. Why adaptation? Because we are seeing the changes in front of our eyes, right? Cardi Sugdub, the small island out of the Caribbean coast of Panama. It's the first indigenous community to have been displaced by climate change. Just 2 years ago, sea level rise increased and increased and increased and increased, and they were displaced by this. They were no longer able to live in the island that they have been living throughout their lives. They are now living in some sort of like random housing that the national government of Panama built for this community. And if we see like trade and the expansion of trade in the agri-food chain is very important, very significant, but all the meteorological services from the countries in Latin America are projecting an increase of 3 to 5 degrees in temperatures in the next 20 to 50 years, 3 to 5 degrees. And that will affect the coffee that we're producing, cacao that we are producing, the avocados that we are producing. What trade will be left with 5 degrees increase in certain regions of Latin America? Even the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, yes, IPCC, has said that food systems are one of the most vulnerable areas in Latin America that we should be focusing on. And there's very little attention to this matter. And if there is one aspect of technological cooperation in between Latin America and the European Union, should be information. So we could have early warnings before dry seasons, before extreme weather events. That's one thing that we should focus on. And just to close, if the COP, if these global negotiations are not working in among all these countries that are participating in COP, then perhaps there is hope in trade agreements between the European Union and Latin America so that we could make this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And to conclude this event, well, I'd like to acknowledge all of the speakers, the panelists, for sharing such insightful perspectives on such a relevant and pressing topic today, which is environmental concerns. As we've discussed, policies, well, aimed at reducing the impacts of climate change are not just important, but they are essential. While international agreements like the Paris Agreement provide a foundation, we've all seen that they're not enough. They need action, and they need action from Colombian governments, they need action from industries, they need action from the European Union. And well, I think if it's okay, do we have maybe a few minutes for some questions from the audience? So if anyone would like to intervene, maybe ask a question, please just raise your hand and we'll.
Thank you very much. I work in the construction industry. I'm professor in a master's degree of sustainable construction. For that reason, I'm so interested in how to implement sustainable practices into the construction industry. So I found all your speeches so interesting, and remind me one continued question in this matter, and is how you think those sustainable practices and sustainable certifications, for example, the reforestation certifications or environmental product declaration certification for construction industries, could be more affordable for small industries, because it's only taken for big industries, big producers, big manufacturers or big farmers, but not for small farmers or not for the small manufacturers. And I think that is a key problem, because they are able to support sustainable practices, but are not affordable for them.
So which of our panelists? Oh, should we take another question before we start answering? Maybe anybody else, if you'd like to raise your hand. Okay, well then, to our panelists, who would like to address this question, please let us know.
I think that it depends on how the provisions are drafted. For example, in the EUDR, the EU has indicated several times in my discussions with EU officials that the EUDR does not represent or require a certification. That the EUDR is a due diligence system in which operators need to exercise due diligence and manage risk. So the important thing is to have the information. It's not to have a certificate, but to have the information. And in order to have the information, for example, in the EUDR, you need to have traceability. And this is geographical traceability. There are several systems available to perform geographical traceability. Some of them are free of charge. Some of them have cost. Some of them are low cost, and some of them are very expensive. So I think that for small producers or companies, when they face these requirements, they need to establish exactly what they have to do. Because we have found out that there is no need for a very complex traceability system within the EUDR. It's very objective, the criteria that you have to meet with respect to not having a crop produced in land that has been subject to deforestation, because there is a date, and you can have the pictures, the satellite pictures, before that date and after that date. So if you want to go further and maybe use this as leverage for example, innovation, and to make things better, then you can go a step ahead. But if you want only to have the information, the minimum information that you need in order to have or to show that you have performed due diligence with respect to researching whether the crop came from land that was subject or not to deforestation prior to or after that date, you only need pictures. So it depends. Yeah.
If I may add to that, I mean, the unspoken dark secret of this whole governance push in global value chains is that it doesn't just make things more difficult for countries in the global south who need to construct something where they lack institutional capacity. It also affects private operators as well, because, you know, regulatory load means that entry costs or upscaling costs become more of a burden. And so that is actually one of the reasons I have heard left and right why some of the big corporations and big industries in the European Union actually supported some of this legislation. And so I think we need to put more emphasis on that. And one of the things that I was hoping to hear it from Nicolas's mouth, but I could almost hear it, but I didn't hear it, and so I'll say it, is we need to address these things as public utilities. So that, and this goes back to the points that Felipe made at the beginning on smallholders, not just in food production, but also in construction and also in industry, the small and medium-sized companies. I've tried to actually get the Chamber of Commerce here to think more in those terms, to provide a service to its members, but they seem to have a hard time to go beyond workshops and training. no, we need an infrastructure, and that needs to take into account those the asymmetries in the burdens that small and medium-sized companies, as well as agricultural producers, need to carry. Thanks.
Thank you both, Nicolas and Juan Manuel. So lastly, I just want to thank all of you here today present. Your interest in this topic and climate change is a testament to how climate action is urgent. And I can only hope that the questions and the answers that the panelists have provided to the audience today motivates each of you and each of us to take steps towards meaningful environmental change. Because actions against climate change cannot be limited to an institutional level. They cannot be limited to an academic level. Actions that create positive change are aligned with sustainable development, and they must be a part of our everyday lives. So, well, lastly, let's please give a well-deserved round of applause to our panelists today for everything that they have said to us today. Climate change.
Muchas gracias por esa conclusión tan inspiradora, Valerie. Vamos a hacer un receso para que puedan ir a almorzar y volvemos a las 2 con el panel de la cooperación birregional en el postconflicto. Por favor, no dejen ninguna de sus pertenencias acá. También el panel de las 2 va a ser en español.
Bravísimo.
Gracias.
Yo sé.
Había tocado esta labor de panel de moderador.
Buen push a European Union.
Oye, soy Álvaro.
¿A qué nos tomamos?
La foto, sí, la foto. ¿Dónde la quieren?
¿Cuál preferimos? ¿Entre los grandes o pequeños?
Mayoría.
No se puede.
No se puede
correr.
Está haciendo mi doctorado en la Universidad de Je voudrais vous présenter à mon collègue qui est plus international public. Je pense qu'il serait content de vous connaître.
Je te suis.
Oui.
Gracias.
Difícil de la comparación con Camilo.
Con Camilo.
No, pero es como mi clase. Hace la
Gracias. Qué bueno, sí. Menos mal. Pues lo expliqué de pronto, pues como están hablando como de temas más globales, pero bueno, es algo que dice muy bien.
La relación